Good evening and welcome back. You ever wondered what stories the wind carried across the first barley fields between two great rivers? When the written word was still new and the boundary between earth and heaven seemed thin as morning mist. What if the oldest myths we possess are not mere stories, but fragments of a cosmic negotiation that the gods themselves tried to forget? If you find peace in these long journeys through forgotten time, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if it truly brings you rest. Let me know where in the world you are listening tonight and what time it is where you rest. Presence here, across all the time zones, reminds us that curiosity and the need for gentle stories transcend every border. Take a moment now to dim the lights around you. Perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum that helps the mind settle. Your breathing slow and your shoulders drop. Now let's ease into tonight's journey together. The land between the rivers has always held secrets in its soil. Long before cuneiform pressed the first stories into clay, long before the great ziggurats rose like man-made mountains toward the stars. The valley between the Tigris and Euphrates knew the rhythm of flood and retreat, of planting and harvest, of human hands learning to shape the earth itself. This was Mesopotamia. Though the people who first called it home would not recognize that Greek name, to them, it was simply the place where the waters came down from the northern mountains, carrying rich silt that turned the flat land dark and fertile. A gift that arrived each year like clockwork. Geography itself seemed designed for the birth of civilization. Two great rivers descended from the Armenian highlands, flowing roughly parallel through a vast alluvial plain before joining and emptying into the Persian Gulf. The Tigris moved faster, carving deeper channels, while the Euphrates wandered more gently, spreading its waters across wider floodplains. Between them stretched hundreds of miles of land that would flood each spring and then retreat, leaving behind the black earth that would feed the world's first cities. But this was not an easy land. The rivers gave life. Yet they also brought destruction when they rose too high, or changed their course without warning. The summer heat could kill, baking the earth until it cracked like broken pottery. The winter rains, when they came, could wash away months of careful work. There were no forests here to speak of, no quarries of good stone. People would have to make their world from mud and reed, from the clay that lay thick along every riverbank. Poets. In the beginning, perhaps 6,000 years before our own time, the first permanent settlements began to take shape. Small clusters of reed houses rose on the higher ground, places where families could outlast the annual floods and tend their growing fields of barley and wheat. These early farmers had learned to read the sky as carefully as they read the soil. When the first green shoots would push through the earth, when the grain would be ready for the sickle. Picture one of these early settlements on a morning in late spring. Floodwaters have recessed for a month now, leaving behind their gift of fertile silt. Smoke rises from cooking fires, where women tend pots of barley porridge, the same grain that will sustain their descendants for millennia to come. Children splash in the shallow channels that still hold the river's retreat, catching fish with their bare hands while their mothers call warnings from the doorways of houses, built from bundles of marsh reeds plastered with mud. The air carries the scent of damp earth and growing grain, the distant bleating of goats, the soft thump of a loom where a grandmother works wool into cloth. An old man sits in the shade of a date palm, eyes fixed on the horizon where heat shimmers already, though the sun has barely cleared the eastern sky. He is watching for dust clouds that might signal approaching traders. or less welcome visitors from rival settlements upstream. These people had no writing yet, but they were not without learning, tracked the movements of the moon and the bright planets, noting how certain stars appeared just before the floods came. They knew which plants could heal and which could kill, which clays made the best pottery, and which ground stones gave the sharpest edges. They told stories around their evening fires, stories that would shape themselves over generations into the myths we are following tonight. In these stories, the world was not empty of purpose. Forces that brought the flood and the drought, the abundance and the famine, had names and personalities. The sky was not a void but a dwelling place, populated by beings who could be reasoned with, but bargained with, perhaps even challenged under the right circumstances. The earth itself pulsed with intention, and human life was woven into a larger pattern that stretched from the depths below to the heights above. Centuries passed, and the settlements grew into towns, then cities. This sense of a populated cosmos only deepened. People developed more sophisticated ways of observing the heavens, building the first platforms and towers that would evolve into the great ziggurats. They learned to channel the river water through networks of canals, extending cultivation far from the natural floodplains. They domesticated new crops and animals, invented the wheel and the sailing ship, began working metals into tools and weapons and ornaments. With each innovation came new stories, new explanations for how the world worked and why humans had been placed within it. The growing complexity of earthly life seemed to mirror a similar complexity in the divine realm. Human society had rulers and subjects, craftsmen and farmers, warriors and priests. Then surely the gods must have their own hierarchies, their own divisions of labour, their own alliances and conflicts. The morning sun that warmed the barley fields was not just a bright circle in the sky, but a deity with a name and a character. The storm that brought the life-giving rain was a god with moods and preferences. The earth that received the seed and gave back the harvest was a goddess with her own desires and demands. High above them all, in the most distant heaven, dwelt the greatest gods, the ones who made the fundamental decisions about how the world would run. By the time the first scribes began pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets, around 3,000 years before our own era, this divine hierarchy had taken on elaborate detail. The gods were organized into generations and families, with complex relationships that reflected and justified the political structures of the growing city-states. Were creator gods and destroyer gods, gods of wisdom and gods of war, gods who favored one city over another, gods whose temples required specific offerings and rituals. Proud as, among all these divine figures, two groups would come to hold special significance in the stories that concern us tonight. The Anunnaki were the established gods, the children and grandchildren of the original creators, the ones who had been granted authority over the earth and its human inhabitants. They dwelt in the lower heaven, close enough to earthly affairs to intervene when necessary, but elevated enough to command absolute respect and obedience. The Igigi were different. Host. They lived in the higher heaven, more distant from the earth, and according to the oldest traditions, they bore a particular burden. They were the ones who performed the cosmic labour that kept the universe running smoothly, the divine workers whose efforts made possible the very existence of both gods and humans below. For countless eons, the stories said. The Igigi had accepted this arrangement without complaint, but the myths that emerged from those early temple libraries spoke of a time when this ancient order was challenged, when the Igigi grew weary of their burden, and took action that would reshape the relationship between heaven and earth forever. Tablets that preserve these stories are fragmentary, and the scribes who recorded them lived thousands of years after the events they described. Yet something in these myths rings with the memory of deep change, of a cosmic negotiation that perhaps the gods themselves preferred to forget. Farmer, working his field in the shadow of the great ziggurat of Babylon, might not think much about divine pine politics as he guided his wooden plough through the black earth. The barley needed planting, the canals needed cleaning. The tax collectors would come, whether the gods were content or restless. But on certain nights, when the wind carried the sound of temple chanting across the fields, when the stars seemed brighter than usual in the clear desert air, he might remember the old stories his grandfather had told, stories of a time when even the gods grew tired, when the order of heaven itself hung in the balance, when decisions were made that would echo through every generation to come. Smell of bread baking in the pre-dawn darkness, the soft lowing of cattle being led to water, the distant call of a night guard announcing that all was well. These sounds of human life continued unchanged, whether the gods were pleased or angry, whether the cosmic balance was stable or trembling on the edge of transformation. Yet the people who lived this daily rhythm also lived within the larger stories that gave meaning to their labour and context to their hopes. In the temple libraries of Uruk and Nippur, where the first true scribes bent over their clay tablets in the flickering light of oil lamps, a new kind of memory was being born. Transition from spoken story to written record did not happen all at once. For generations, the keepers of sacred knowledge had carried the myths in their minds, passing them from teacher to student, through careful repetition and ritual recitation. Each telling was both the same and different, shaped by the voice of the storyteller and the needs of the moment. But as the cities grew larger and their reach extended farther across the river valleys, the need arose for a more permanent way to preserve the essential stories, the ones that explained how the world came to be and why humans held their particular place within it. The earliest cuneiform tablets that mention the divine hierarchy are difficult to read. Their wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay that has survived 4 millennia underground. The scribes who made these records were still learning how to capture speech in writing, still developing the conventions that would allow complex narratives to be preserved exactly from one generation to the next. But even in these fragmentary texts, we can glimpse the outlines of a vast cosmological system that was already ancient when they were written. According to these early sources, the divine realm was structured as carefully as any earthly kingdom. At the summit dwelt Anu, the sky god whose name meant simply heaven and whose authority extended over all creation. Below him came Enlil, the lord of the air and wind, and Enki, master of the sweet waters that flowed beneath the earth and brought fertility to the land. These were the great gods, the decision-makers, whose will shaped the fundamental laws that governed both heaven and earth. The tablets also speak of 2 groups of lesser gods, whose relationship would prove crucial to the myths we are exploring. The Anunnaki were described as the children and followers of the great gods, divine beings, who had been granted authority over earthly affairs. Their name appears to have meant those of royal blood, or offspring of Anu, and they were associated with the underworld, with judgment, and with the governance of human destiny. When humans died, it was before the Anunnaki that their souls would be judged. When cities rose or fell, it was the Anunnaki who had decreed their fate. The Igigi were more mysterious. Their name's meaning is less certain. though some scholars believe it may have referred to those who watch or the Watchers. Unlike the Anunnaki, who were said to dwell in the lower heavens close to Earth, the Igigi inhabited the highest heaven, the most remote realm of the divine cosmos. They were described as numerous, perhaps as many as 300 according to some traditions, and they bore the responsibility for cosmic labor that kept the universe functioning. Picture a scribe named Nabu Rimani working by lamplight in a small chamber deep within the temple complex at Babylon. The year is perhaps 2100 before our era, and he has been given the task of copying an ancient epic onto fresh clay tablets for the temple library. His reed stylus moves carefully across the soft surface, pressing the wedge-shaped marks that will preserve this story for future generations. Around him, shelves hold hundreds of other tablets containing hymns, prayers, legal codes, astronomical observations, and myths that stretch back to the very beginning of written memory. The story he is copying tells of the early days of creation, when the cosmos was young and the division of divine labor had not yet been settled. In those times, according to the myth, the great gods lived in leisure while the Igigi performed all the necessary work of maintaining the universe. They dug the canals that carried the celestial waters. They maintained the boundaries between the different realms of creation. They ensured that the stars followed their proper courses and the seasons arrived on schedule. For countless ages, the story continued. This arrangement persisted without complaint. The Igigi accepted their role as cosmic workers, understanding that their labor was essential to the stability of all existence. They were honored for their service. But honor did not relieve them of their burden. Day after day, cycle after cycle, they carried out their taskings in the remote heights of heaven, far from the earthly realm that benefited from their efforts. The scribe pauses in his work, dipping his stylus in water to clean it before continuing. Through the small window of his chamber, he can hear the sounds of the city settling into sleep. Mother singing softly to her child, the footsteps of the night watch making their rounds, the distant splash of a fisherman casting his net in the canal that runs past the temple walls. These sounds of human life continue their ancient rhythm, while he works to preserve stories of an even more ancient time. The tablets speak of other gods as well, figures whose names appear throughout the mythological literature of Mesopotamia. Ninlil, the grain goddess, whose marriage to Enlil brought forth the first harvest. Ninhursag, the mother goddess who shaped humans from clay at the beginning of time. Tu, the sun god, who crossed the sky each day in his fiery chariot, bringing light and justice to the world below. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, whose beauty could inspire both creation and destruction. Each of these divine figures had their own temples, their own priesthoods, their own festivals and rituals. The religious calendar of a typical Mesopotamian city was dense with celebrations, honouring different gods at different times of year. During the spring floods, offerings were made to ensure that the waters would bring fertility rather than destruction. At harvest time, ceremonies gave thanks for the grain and asked blessing for the coming year's planting. In the depths of winter, rituals sought to encourage the sun's return and the renewal of life. Yet beneath all these specific observances lay the larger story of cosmic order, the narrative that explained why the gods demanded worship and why humans owed them absolute obedience. According to the myths preserved in the temple libraries, humanity had been created for a specific purpose: to serve the gods through labor and ritual, to provide them with the offerings and praise they required, to maintain on earth the temples that were their dwelling places among mortals. Krot, This arrangement was presented as both natural and eternal, just as the stars followed their appointed courses and the seasons succeeded one another in proper order. So humans were bound to their role as servants of the divine realm. The gods had created them, sustained them, and granted them the knowledge necessary for civilization. In return, humans owed everything they possessed to their divine masters. But the scribes who recorded these myths also preserved stories that suggested this eternal order had not always been unchallenged. Hidden within the great creation epics were hints of an earlier time, a period when even the cosmic hierarchy itself had been subject to change. The most intriguing of these hints concerned the relationship between the Anunnaki and the Igigi, the two groups of lesser gods whose interaction would prove crucial to understanding how the divine realm actually functioned. According to the oldest fragments, there had been a time when the burden of cosmic labour fell entirely upon the Igigi. They were the ones who performed the difficult and exhausting work that kept the universe running smoothly. The Anunnaki, closer to the earthly realm and more favoured by the great gods, were free to enjoy the benefits of creation without bearing its costs. This division of labour was apparently accepted by both groups for countless eons, justified by their different positions within the divine hierarchy. A young priestess named Ningal walks through the temple courtyard in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying water for the morning rituals. The stars are still bright overhead, though the eastern horizon shows the first pale hint of sunrise. She has been trained since childhood in the sacred traditions, taught to read the cuneiform tablets that contain the temple's most precious knowledge. Among these texts are the creation myths that speak of the Igigi and their ancient burden, stories that she recites during certain ceremonies, though their full meaning remains mysterious even to the senior priests. As she pours the water into the ritual basin, she thinks about the stories her teachers have shared, tales of a time when even the gods grew weary of their appointed tasks. The idea seems almost blasphemous, for how could divine beings experience fatigue or dissatisfaction? Yet the tablets speak clearly of such a time when the established order of heaven faced its greatest challenge, and the relationship between gods and mortals was forever changed. Cuneiform sources that mention this cosmic crisis are scattered across many different tablets and traditions. Some are preserved in the great creation epic, known as Atrahasis. Others appear in the Enuma Elish and related Babylonian texts. Still others survive only in fragments, broken tablets whose missing sections leave tantalizing gaps in the narrative. Taken together, these sources paint a picture of divine unrest that began in the highest heaven and eventually transformed the entire cosmic order. The Igigi, according to these traditions, were the first to question the eternal arrangement that bound them to unending labour, countless eons of service. They began to ask why they alone should bear the burden of maintaining the universe, while other gods enjoyed the fruits of creation without sharing its costs. This question, once raised, could not be easily answered or dismissed. The morning light strengthens as the priestess completes her preparations for the day's first ceremony. Soon the temple will fill with worshippers, bringing offerings of grain and oil, seeking the gods' blessing for their daily work. Bronze bells that hang from the ziggurat's corners will ring out across the city, calling the faithful to remember their obligations to the divine realm. Yet, beneath all this familiar ritual lies the echo of an ancient crisis, a time when even the gods themselves struggled with questions of duty and fairness, of service and reward. Tablets that preserve these stories were copied, and recopied across many centuries, passed down through generations of scribes who may not have fully understood their significance. Some details were probably lost or altered in transmission, while others may have been deliberately modified to serve the political or theological needs of later dynasties. The core narrative remained remarkably consistent across different cities and time periods, suggesting that it preserved the memory of events that the ancient world considered both real and important. The sun climbs higher, and the temple activities shift into their familiar daily rhythm. The great story of cosmic labor and divine rebellion waits patiently in the clay tablets, ready to be told again by those who seek to understand how the world came to be as it is, and why the relationship between heaven and earth carries within it the memory of ancient negotiations that shaped the destiny of gods and mortals alike. The knowledge that had once lived only in human memory now spread like water through irrigation channels, carried from temple to temple across the growing network of Mesopotamian cities. Within a century of those first experimental marks pressed into clay, the art of writing had transformed from a simple method of record-keeping into something far more powerful, a way of preserving the exact words of gods and kings, of fixing forever the stories that explained how the world worked, and who held authority within it. The scribes who mastered this new technology found themselves occupying a position of extraordinary influence, for they alone could read the tablets that contained the accumulated wisdom of generations, and they alone could create new tablets that would carry their knowledge into the future. Great city of Uruk, where many scholars believe writing itself was born, became a beacon for those seeking to learn the scribal arts. Its massive temple complex, dedicated to the sky god Anu and the goddess Inanna, housed libraries that drew students from settlements hundreds of miles away. Young men, and occasionally women, would travel for weeks down the Euphrates River or along the ancient trade routes to study in Uruk's schools, where master scribes taught not only the technical skills of cuneiform writing, but also the sacred traditions that gave meaning to their work. Picture the journey of one such student, a young man named Nansh from a smaller city near the confluence of the two great rivers. He has been chosen by his family and local temple to receive training in the scribal arts, a selection that represents both great honour and considerable expense. His father, a successful merchant, has provided him with materials for the journey: a leather pouch containing silver rings for payment, a small stock of barley cakes and dried fish, a wooden tablet coated with wax for practice exercises, and a handful of reed styluses carefully shaped for writing. The boat that carries him downstream toward Uruk moves slowly against the current, its crew of 3 men taking turns at the long steering oar, while the rectangular sail catches what wind it can find. Journey takes 5 days, following the meandering course of the Euphrates, through landscapes that shift from green agricultural districts to brown desert, and back to green again. Along the way, they pass other cities with their own temple towers rising above the surrounding fields, other centres of learning, where scribes preserve their own versions of the ancient stories. At the great ziggurat catches the morning light like a man-made mountain, its steps climbing toward the sky in levels of burnt brick and bitumen. The city controls the mouth of the Euphrates and the trade routes that connect Mesopotamia to the wider world, and its temples house records of commercial transactions that stretch back many generations. Priests here claim special authority in matters of divine law, for their temple precinct includes the most ancient burial grounds where the kings of the early dynasties were interred with golden treasures that speak of unimaginable wealth and power. Further north, the sacred city of Nippur occupies a position that transcends the political boundaries of any single kingdom. Here stands the temple of Enlil, the air god, whose authority is acknowledged by rulers throughout the region. King can claim legitimate power without the blessing of Nippur's priests. And the city's scribal schools maintain the most authoritative versions of the creation myths and legal codes that govern relations between the different city-states. Tablets preserved in Nippur's libraries are copied and distributed throughout Mesopotamia, creating a standardized body of religious and legal knowledge that helps maintain cultural unity across political divisions. Eridu, perhaps the oldest of all the great cities, sits near the marshy shores of the Persian Gulf, where the Euphrates splits into multiple channels before reaching the sea. According to the oldest traditions, this was where human civilization itself began, where the first king received the divine gifts of writing and law directly from the god Enki. The scribes of Eridu specialize in preserving the most ancient myths, the stories that tell of the very beginning of the world, and the first interactions between gods and mortals. When Ernanchi finally arrives in Uruk, the city overwhelms him with its size and complexity. Temple Quarter alone covers hundreds of acres, its buildings rising in successive terraces that culminate in the Great Ziggurat, whose peak seems to touch the sky itself. The walls that surround the city stretch for miles, enclosing neighborhoods of craftsmen and merchants, warehouses and markets, private houses and public squares, population numbers in the tens of thousands, making it one of the largest concentrations of human beings anywhere in the world. He presents himself at the scribal school attached to the Temple of Anu, where a senior scribe examines his credentials and assigns him to a dormitory shared with other students from distant cities. The quarters are simple but adequate. Sleeping mats arranged along the walls of a rectangular room, wooden chests for personal possessions, oil lamps for study after dark. The walls are lined with shelves holding practice tablets and reference works, and the air carries the permanent scent of clay dust and lamp oil that marks any place where serious writing is done. Training begins before dawn with prayers to Nabu, the god of writing and wisdom, whose blessing is essential for anyone who hopes to master the scribal arts. The students gather in the main instruction hall, where rows of low benches face a platform, where the master scribe demonstrates the proper formation of cuneiform signs. Each sign must be made with precise movements of the reed stylus, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay at exactly the right angle and depth to ensure clarity and permanence. The earliest lessons focus on simple word signs and basic numerical notation, the skills needed for temple record-keeping and commercial transactions. Students practice on tablets of soft clay, writing the same signs over and over until their hands develop the muscle memory needed for speed and accuracy. When a tablet is filled with practice exercises, it can be dampened and smoothed for reuse, though particularly good examples are sometimes fired in kilns and kept as models for future students. As the weeks pass and basic competence develops, the lessons gradually expand to include more complex texts. The students learn to read and copy hymns to various gods, legal formulas used in contracts and court proceedings, astronomical observations that track the movements of stars and planets. They study the standardized versions of historical chronicles that record the deeds of famous kings, learning not only to read these texts, but to understand their proper interpretation and application. The most advanced students, those who show exceptional skill and dedication, are introduced to the great mythological texts that form the foundation of Mesopotamian religious thought. These stories, far more complex than the simple hymns and prayers of elementary instruction, require years of study to master fully. Cuneiform signs that preserve them represent not just sounds and words, but entire theological concepts that have been refined over generations of scholarly discussion and debate. Among these advanced texts are the creation myths that speak of the Anunnaki and Igigi, the stories that explain how the cosmic order came to be established and why it occasionally faced challenges that threatened its stability. Master scribes treat these narratives with special reverence, for they contain knowledge that reaches back to the very beginning of time and forward to the ultimate destiny of all creation. Students who prove worthy to study these texts understand that they are becoming guardians of wisdom that connects their daily work to the fundamental structure of the universe itself. An elderly scribe named Shamash Mubalit has spent 40 years copying and teaching these sacred narratives. His fingers, permanently stained with clay dust, move across the tablet surface with the unconscious precision that comes only from decades of practice. He knows the creation myths so thoroughly that he can recite them from memory. Yet he still consults the master tablets to ensure that every sign is copied exactly as it was written by the scribes who came before him. These stories, he teaches his students, are not merely human compositions but divine revelations that must be preserved without alteration or interpretation. The process of standardization that occurs in these scribal schools serves purposes that extend far beyond simple education. As students from different cities learn to read and write the same versions of religious and legal texts, they create a shared cultural foundation that helps maintain unity across the politically fragmented landscape of Mesopotamia. A scribe trained in Uruk can travel to Babylon or Mari and find that his skills are immediately useful, that the tablets he learned to read in one city contain the same stories and laws recognized in another. This standardization also serves the interests of political power, for control over religious narratives translates directly into authority over human behavior. Kings who can claim the support of the established temples, who can point to ancient texts that justify their rule and their policies, possess a legitimacy that no amount of military force can provide. The scribes who preserve and copy these texts therefore find themselves at the center of a complex web of relationships that connects divine authority to earthly power. The training of scribes involves not only technical skills but also careful instruction in the proper relationship between different versions of the same story. Some myths exist in multiple variants, with details that differ depending on which city or time period produced them. Students learn to recognize these variations and to understand their significance. A version of the creation myth that emphasizes the role of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, serves different political purposes than one that highlights Enlil of Nippur or Enki of Eridu caste. In the case of the stories concerning the Igigi and Anunnaki, scribes learn that different traditions preserved different emphases and details. Some versions focus on the cosmic labor that the Igigi performed, describing in elaborate detail the tasks that kept the universe functioning. Others emphasize the relationship between the Igigi and the Anunnaki, the tensions that eventually led to the great crisis that reshape the divine order. Still others concentrate on the consequences of that crisis, the new arrangements that were established to prevent its recurrence. A typical day in the scribal school begins with the first light of dawn filtering through the small windows high in the instruction hall walls, the students gather for morning prayers, their voices joining in the ancient hymns that invoke divine blessing on their work. Then comes the distribution of fresh clay tablets, each one carefully prepared by temple servants who mix the clay with precise amounts of water and temper to achieve the proper consistency for writing. Master Scribe announces the day's lesson, perhaps a section from the Atrahasis epic that tells of the early days of creation when the cosmic order was still taking shape. The students dip their styluses in water and begin to copy, their eyes moving between the master tablet and their own work, their hands forming the wedge-shaped marks that will preserve this ancient wisdom for another generation. The sound of styluses on clay fills the hall, a soft percussion that marks the rhythm of learning and preservation. The morning progresses, and the students work their way through the assigned text. The master scribe moves among them, offering corrections and guidance. A sign that is too shallow will not survive the firing process that hardens the clay into permanent form. A sign that is too deep may crack the tablet or blur into illegibility. Pressure must be just right, the angle precise, the spacing consistent throughout the entire composition. Breaks between lessons, students often discuss the meaning of the texts they are copying, trying to understand the theological concepts embedded in the ancient narratives. The relationship between the Igigi and Anunnaki, in particular, raises questions that challenge some of the fundamental assumptions about divine authority and cosmic order. If the gods themselves could grow dissatisfied with their appointed roles, if even the highest heaven could experience conflict and change, what did this mean for the stability of the world that humans inhabited below? Forced. These discussions take place in whispered conversations in the dormitories. After dark, when the oil lamps burn low and the sounds of the great city settle into the quiet rhythms of night, students understand that they are dealing with knowledge that carries both privilege and responsibility, that their mastery of these texts will eventually position them as mediators between the divine realm and the human world. The stories they are learning to preserve and transmit will shape the understanding of countless generations, influencing how future rulers justify their authority and how ordinary people make sense of their place in the cosmic order. The education of a scribe typically takes between 5 and 7 years, depending on the student's aptitude and the level of expertise required for his intended role. Those destined for positions in royal courts or major temple administrations receive more extensive training than those who will serve in local temples or commercial establishments. All must achieve basic competence in reading and writing cuneiform, and all must demonstrate familiarity with the core texts that preserve the religious and legal foundations of Mesopotamian civilization. Ernanshi progresses through his studies. He gradually develops not only technical skill, but also a deeper appreciation for the sacred responsibility that scribes bear. Tablets he learns to create will outlast his own lifetime, carrying forward the wisdom of ages past and making it available to readers yet unborn. The stories of divine conflict and cosmic negotiation that he copies with such careful attention to detail are not merely historical curiosities, but living knowledge that continues to shape how people understand their relationship to the forces that govern their lives. Sun sets behind the massive walls of Uruk as another day of instruction comes to an end. The students clean their styluses and arrange their practice tablets for review by the master scribes. In the gathering darkness, the temple complex settles into the quiet rhythms that have marked its routine for countless generations. Tomorrow will bring new lessons, new texts to copy, new insights into the ancient wisdom that connects the human world to the divine realm above. The knowledge they preserve speaks of times when even heaven itself was not free from change, when the gods themselves faced questions about duty and justice that would echo through every generation of mortals who sought to understand their place in the cosmic order. These are the stories that wait in the clay, ready to reveal their secrets to those patient enough to learn the difficult art of reading the words that connect the present moment to the very beginning of time. Tablets that preserve the story of cosmic rebellion were already ancient when the scribes of Babylon first copied them onto fresh clay, their narrative reaching back through generations of oral tradition to events that may have occurred in the earliest days of creation itself. Among all the mythological texts that emerged from the temple libraries of Mesopotamia, few would prove as influential or as controversial as the epic poem known to modern scholars as Atrahasis, named for its human hero, but containing within its verses the most detailed account of divine labour, celestial unrest, and the cosmic crisis that forever changed the relationship between heaven and earth. Poem exists in multiple versions, copied and recopied across more than 1,000 years, with fragments surviving from libraries as distant as Nineveh in the north and Sippar in the central region, suggesting that its themes resonated throughout the ancient Near East. The story begins, as so many creation myths do, with the fundamental division of cosmic authority among the great gods, Sard. The earliest days when the universe was young and its basic structure still taking shape. The supreme god Anu retained dominion over the highest heaven, that remote realm from which all divine authority ultimately flowed. Below him, Enlil received control of the earth and the air that surrounded it, while Enki was granted mastery over the fresh waters that lay beneath the earth and brought fertility to the land above. Threefold division created the basic framework within which all subsequent divine activity would unfold. Anu, dwelling in the heights of heaven, served as the ultimate source of authority, but rarely intervened directly in earthly affairs. Enlil, positioned between heaven and earth, became the executive power who implemented divine decisions and maintained order in the created world. Enki, associated with the life-giving waters and the wisdom needed for civilization, took responsibility for ensuring that the earth could sustain the life that the gods intended to create. But the tablets make clear that this arrangement among the great gods was only the beginning of cosmic organization. Beneath the three supreme powers lay multiple generations of lesser deities, divine beings whose roles and responsibilities had to be defined and allocated according to their position in the celestial hierarchy. Pos. The most important of these subordinate groups were the Anunnaki and the Igigi, whose relationship would prove central to the crisis that the myth describes. Picture a scribe named Utlishara working late into the night in his chamber within the temple of Marduk at Babylon, copying portions of the Atrahasis epic onto a series of tablets that will eventually contain the complete narrative. Post. The year is perhaps 1600 before our era, and he has been commissioned by the chief priest to create a new edition of the text for the temple library. His oil lamp casts flickering shadows on the cuneiform signs. As he works, each wedge-shaped mark pressed with careful precision into the soft clay surface. Text he is copying speaks of the early organization of divine labor. When the cosmic order was first being established, and every supernatural being was assigned specific tasks that would contribute to the smooth functioning of the universe. According to the myth, the Anunnaki were granted authority over earthly affairs and the underworld, serving as judges and administrators who would govern the realm of mortal existence once it came into being. Position was prestigious, and their responsibility significant. But their duties did not require the kind of exhausting physical labour that kept the cosmos running day by day. The Igigi received a very different assignment. They were designated as the workers of heaven, the divine beings whose constant effort maintained the fundamental processes that made all other life possible. Tablets described tasks in terms that would have been familiar to any Mesopotamian farmer or labourer. They dug the great cosmic canals that carried the celestial waters, the stands, maintained the boundaries that separated different regions of creation. They ensured that the stars followed their proper courses across the night sky. This divine labour was described as both necessary and honourable. The Igigi were not slaves but cosmic engineers, whose specialised knowledge and tireless effort kept the universe functioning properly. Their work enabled the great gods to pursue higher concerns of governance and creativity, while making possible the very existence of the Anunnaki and eventually of mortal creatures as well, for countless eons, according to the myth. This arrangement proceeded without complaint or challenge. The epic provides glimpses of what this cosmic labour actually entailed. The Igigi dug channels for the great rivers that would one day water the earth, carrying divine pickaxes and baskets as they shaped the fundamental geography of creation. They laid out the pathways that the sun and moon would follow in their daily and monthly journeys across the sky. They established the seasonal patterns that would govern agricultural life, ensuring that spring would reliably follow winter and harvest would succeed planting. The work was difficult and unending, unlike earthly labourers, who could rest at sunset and sleep through the night. The Igigi faced tasks that required constant attention. The stars needed guidance. Every night, the cosmic waters required daily maintenance. The boundaries between different realms had to be monitored continuously to prevent chaos from breaking through. Generation after generation of Igigi accepted these responsibilities, understanding their work as essential service that maintained the stability of all existence. Temple servant named Rimsinili tends the lamps in the scribal chamber as Utilishara continues his copying work. The oil must be replenished regularly to maintain steady light, and the wicks require careful trimming to prevent smoking that might damage the precious tablets. Through the small window of the chamber, he can see the great ziggurat rising into the star-filled darkness, its stepped sides climbing toward the realm where the ancient gods first established their cosmic order. The Atrahasis epic suggests that the crisis began gradually, not with any sudden rebellion, but with a slow accumulation of divine discontent that eventually reached a breaking point. What the text describes as 40 years of constant labour. Though divine time may follow different rules than mortal chronology, the Igigi began to question the arrangement that bound them to unending toil, while other gods enjoyed the fruits of their work without sharing its burdens. The tablets preserve fragments of divine complaint that provide insight into the thinking of the cosmic workers. The Igigi spoke among themselves about the fairness of an arrangement that required them to bear all the physical labour of maintaining the universe, while the Anunnaki lived in comfort and ease. They questioned why their essential contributions to cosmic stability should be taken for granted, while the administrative functions of the Anunnaki were honoured and rewarded. These conversations, conducted in the highest heaven, far from the dwelling places of the great gods, gradually developed into a more organised expression of divine grievance. the Igigi began to coordinate their complaints, sharing their concerns across the different groups responsible for various aspects of cosmic maintenance. What had started as individual dissatisfaction slowly transformed into collective questioning of the entire system of divine labor allocation. Text describes the moment when this divine unrest reached its climax. The Igigi, after generations of faithful service and growing frustration, made a decision that would shake the foundations of the cosmic order. They ceased their labor. Divine pickaxes and baskets that shaped the rivers and channels of creation were thrown down. The constant work of maintaining cosmic boundaries and stellar movements came to an abrupt halt. The consequences of this divine strike were immediate and alarming. Careful order that the Igigi's labor had maintained began to break down. The celestial waters that they had channeled started to overflow their boundaries, threatening to flood the carefully structured realms of creation. The stars wandered from their appointed paths, disrupting the seasonal cycles that governed agricultural life. Fundamental processes that sustained the universe itself began to falter without the constant attention they required. The great gods, accustomed to the smooth functioning that Igigi labor had always provided, found themselves facing the first serious challenge to their cosmic authority. Enlil, as the executive power responsible for maintaining order, was particularly disturbed by this unprecedented breakdown of divine discipline. The rebellion of the Igigi represented not merely a labor dispute, but a fundamental questioning of the hierarchical structure that organized all existence. The tablets suggest that the initial divine response was anger and incomprehension. Great gods had established the cosmic order according to their wisdom and authority, assigning roles and responsibility based on what they understood to be the natural hierarchy of divine capabilities. The idea that subordinate gods might question these arrangements, might refuse to accept their assigned duties, challenged assumptions that had governed creation since its beginning. Enlil's reaction, according to the myth, was to consider punishment severe enough to end the rebellion permanently. Some versions of the story suggest that he contemplated the complete destruction of the Igigi, the elimination of the divine workers who had dared to challenge the cosmic order. Such a response would have restored divine discipline, but at the cost of leaving essential cosmic labor without anyone to perform it. Crisis deepened as the consequences of Igigi inaction spread throughout the divine realm. Breakdown of cosmic maintenance affected not only the remote regions of highest heaven, but began to threaten the stability of earthly existence as well. The rivers that watered the land, the seasonal cycles that governed agricultural life, the very boundaries between order and chaos, all of these fundamental features of created reality depended on the constant labor that the Igigi had abandoned. An older priest named Nabu Shumakin enters the scribal chamber carrying fresh clay tablets for the continuing work of copying. He has served in the temple of Marduk for more than 30 years, long enough to have seen the great festivals of spring and autumn cycle through their endless repetition, marking the seasons that the ancient myths describe as gifts of divine labor. Rebellion of the Igigi. He reflects, speaks to questions about duty and justice that resonate even in the mortal realm, where farmers and craftsmen sometimes wonder why their essential work receives less honor than the administrative functions of priests and nobles. The myth preserves what may be the most crucial moment in the entire narrative: the intervention of Enki, the god of wisdom, and the sweet waters that bring life to the earth. Unlike Enlil, whose response to the crisis focused on reasserting divine authority through punishment. Enki approached the problem as an engineer seeking a practical solution. He recognized that the Igigi's complaints contained an element of justice, that the cosmic order, as originally established, placed an unfair burden on the divine workers while exempting others from sharing the essential labor of maintaining creation. Enki's proposal, which would reshape the entire relationship between heaven and earth, was both radical and practical. Instead of simply punishing the rebellious Igigi or forcing them back to their abandoned tasks, he suggested creating an entirely new category of being specifically designed to perform the cosmic labor that the Igigi found so burdensome. These new creatures would be mortal rather than divine, numerous enough to handle the extensive work required, and grateful for the opportunity to serve the cosmic order that sustained their existence. The tablets that preserve this portion of the story describe lengthy negotiations among the great gods as they considered Enki's proposal. Creation of mortal beings to serve divine purposes represented a fundamental departure from the original cosmic plan, requiring careful consideration of how such creatures would be made, what capabilities they would possess, and how their relationship to the divine realm would be regulated. Anu, speaking with the supreme authority of highest heaven, eventually endorsed the wisdom of Enki's suggestion. Cosmic order needed to be maintained, and the Igigi had demonstrated that they could not be relied upon to continue their labor indefinitely without complaint or rebellion. Creating mortal servants offered a solution that would satisfy the legitimate grievances of the divine workers, while ensuring that essential cosmic tasks continued to be performed. The decision to create humanity thus emerged not from divine generosity or love, but from a practical need to resolve a crisis in the cosmic labor system. Humans would be designed specifically to serve the gods, to perform the worship and ritual activity that divine beings required, and to maintain on Earth the temples and ceremonies that connected the mortal realm to the powers above. In exchange for faithful service, they would receive the gift of life itself and the knowledge necessary for civilization. The Atrahasis epic describes the actual creation process in terms that blend theological speculation with practical knowledge of craftsmanship. Enki and the mother goddess Nintu work together to fate the first humans from clay, mixed with the blood of a sacrificed god, creating beings who possess enough divine essence to understand their cosmic responsibilities, while remaining mortal enough to accept their subordinate position, without the questioning that had led to the Igigi rebellion. The success of this divine solution becomes apparent as the narrative continues. The newly created humans readily accept their role as servants of the gods, establishing the temples and rituals that provide divine beings with the worship they require. The cosmic labor that the Igigi had abandoned is divided between continuing divine supervision and human practical work, creating a new balance that satisfies all parties to the ancient conflict. The Igigi, relieved of the most burdensome aspects of their cosmic responsibilities, return to their positions in the highest heaven with renewed appreciation for the divine hierarchy. The Anunnaki continue their administrative functions as judges and governors of earthly affairs, but now work in cooperation with human servants who handle many of the practical details of maintaining cosmic order. The great gods achieve their goal of stable cosmic governance without the threat of further divine rebellion. Yet the myth suggests that this resolution carried within it the seeds of future challenges. Creation of humanity as a solution to divine labor problems established a precedent for cosmic innovation, demonstrating that even the most fundamental arrangements of creation could be modified when circumstances required change. The Igigi had proven that divine authority was not absolute, that even cosmic order itself was subject to negotiation and revision when those who bore its burdens found them unjust or unbearable. Tablets end this portion of the narrative with descriptions of early human civilization, the first cities and temples rising from the fertile earth as mortals learn to fulfill their cosmic responsibilities. The divine crisis has been resolved, but its memory lingers in the stories that humans tell about their origins and purpose. They understand themselves as beings created to serve, but they also inherit the knowledge that service itself can be questioned, that even the gods must sometimes negotiate the terms of cosmic order. Utl Ishara completes another tablet in his series. Setting it aside to dry before firing, he reflects on the implications of the story he has been copying. The rebellion of the Igigi speaks to universal questions about work and reward, duty and justice, that resonate in every human society. Cosmic crisis that led to human creations, Tian's, suggests that even divine authority must sometimes bend to accommodate the legitimate complaints of those who bear the burdens of maintaining order. The first light of dawn begins to filter through the chamber window as the long night of copying work draws toward its close. The sounds of the awakening city drift through the temple walls. The lowing of cattle being led to water, the call of bread vendors announcing their morning offerings, the soft chanting of priests beginning the day's first rituals. These familiar sounds of human activity exist because of the ancient crisis in heaven, the divine rebellion that forced the gods to reconsider how cosmic order should be maintained and who should bear responsibility for its preservation. The story preserved in the clay tablets speaks of negotiations that took place in the highest heaven, decisions that shaped the fundamental structure of existence itself. Yet its themes resonate in every human heart that has ever questioned the fairness of earthly arrangements, that has wondered why some bear heavy burdens while others enjoy the fruits of their labour without sharing its costs. Rebellion of the Igigi reminds us that even in the divine realm, justice sometimes requires to challenge established authority and demand more equitable arrangements for all who contribute to the common good. In the generations that followed the great cosmic settlement, the new arrangement between heaven and earth took root in the daily rhythms of human life, like barley seed in the rich alluvial soil of the river valleys. The solution that had resolved the divine crisis now shaped every aspect of mortal existence, from the pre-dawn prayers that began each day to the evening offerings that marked its close. The temples that rose in every city and town served as constant reminders of humanity's cosmic purpose, their stepped towers climbing toward the sky like stone ladders connecting earth to the dwelling places of the gods. Within these sacred precincts, priests and priestesses maintained the rituals that had been established to fulfill the divine bargain, ensuring that the gods received the worship and service they required, while humans enjoyed the protection and prosperity that faithful service could bring. Picture the city of Babylon in the early morning light of a day in late spring, perhaps 3.5 millennia before our own time. Great Euphrates flows past the city walls, carrying the silt-rich waters that will soon spread across the fields to nourish the barley and wheat that form the foundation of human survival. The sun has just cleared the eastern horizon, painting the stepped sides of the massive ziggurat with golden light and casting long shadows across the streets and courtyards where the day's activities are beginning. in the temple quarter that dominates the city centre. The day begins before dawn with the lighting of the sacred fires that will burn continuously until sunset. A young priestess named Belitseri moves through the corridors carrying a bronze lamp filled with precious cedar oil, touching its flame to the wicks that will illuminate the shrine of Marduk, the city's patron deity. Movements follow patterns established by countless generations of temple servants, each gesture prescribed by rituals that connect this morning's service to the cosmic bargain. Struck in the highest heaven when the world was young, the chamber where she works contains a golden statue of the god, crafted by the finest artisans and clothed in garments woven from silk and linen imported from distant lands. Before this divine image, tables hold the morning offerings that citizens have brought to secure divine favour for the coming day. Loaves of bread baked from the finest flour, jars of beer brewed according to ancient formulas, cuts of meat from animals that have been examined carefully to ensure their perfection for sacred use. Ritual of the morning meal follows patterns that mirror those of an earthly household. For the gods are understood to have needs and preferences similar to those of powerful human rulers. Bread must be broken and arranged. On golden plates, the beer poured into silver cups. The meat prepared and seasoned according to recipes that have been passed down through generations of temple cooks. These offerings will remain before the god throughout the day, providing sustenance for the divine being whose continued favour ensures the prosperity of the city and its inhabitants. The sun climbs higher, and the temple activities shift into their familiar rhythm. The broader city awakens to the business of daily life. For in the residential quarters beyond the sacred precinct, families begin their own morning routines with prayers and small offerings that acknowledge their dependence on divine protection. Potter named Nabu Shum Liber kneels beside his workshop, placing a small cake of barley bread and a cup of beer before a household shrine that contains clay figures of his family's protective gods. Pottery he creates serves both practical and sacred purposes, for the jars and bowls that hold food and drink are also used in temple ceremonies and household rituals. Each piece must be shaped with care and attention to detail, not only for functional reasons, but because imperfect vessels might offend the gods and bring misfortune on the craftsman and his family. The clay itself is sacred, drawn from the same earth that the gods used to create the first humans, and working with it requires both technical skill and spiritual awareness. In the markets that surround the temple quarter, merchants arrange their wares in displays that reflect the cosmic order established when humanity accepted its role as servant of the divine realm. Finest goods, precious metals, rare spices, exotic textiles are reserved for temple use and the households of the wealthy, whose prosperity demonstrates divine favour. More common items, grain, vegetables, simple pottery, everyday clothing, serve the needs of ordinary citizens whose faithful service earns them the basic necessities of life. Merchant named Sinlekiunini oversees the loading of a boat that will carry barley downstream to the city of where it will be traded for silver and other goods that Babylon cannot produce locally. The grain comes from fields that are flooded each spring by the carefully managed overflow of the Euphrates. Water that is understood to flow according to divine will and for divine purposes. Farmers who grew this barley began their planting season with ceremonies that invoked the blessings of the earth goddess. And they will end the harvest with festivals that give thanks for the abundance that faithful service has earned. The agricultural cycle that sustains the city follows patterns that were established when the gods first created humans to serve their purposes. Flooding of the fields in early spring corresponds to the renewal of the cosmic contract, when divine powers agree to provide another year of fertility in exchange for continued human worship and obedience. Growth of the crops through the long summer months reflects the gradual accumulation of divine favor that results from faithful temple service and proper ritual observance. During the dry season, when the river flows low between its banks and the fields lie fallow under the blazing sun, the relationship between gods and humans takes on a different character. This is the time for major temple renovations, when human labor serves divine purposes by maintaining and improving the earthly dwelling places of supernatural beings. Work crews repair the ziggurat's brick faces, artisans create new cult objects for temple shrines, and scribes copy sacred texts onto fresh clay tablets that will preserve divine wisdom for future generations. Master builder named Naram Sin directs the reconstruction of a section of temple wall that has been damaged by the previous year's floods. Bricks he uses are made from the same clay that forms the foundation of all Mesopotamian construction. But each one must be shaped and fired according to specifications that ensure both structural integrity and ritual purity. The mortar that binds them together contains bitumen drawn from springs that are understood to be gifts from the underworld gods, connecting the temple's physical structure to the cosmic foundations that support all existence. Workers who carry out these constructions represent the same principle that led to human creation in the first place. Their labor serves divine purposes while providing them with the wages needed to support their families and maintain their place in the social order. The temple that rises from their efforts will stand for generations, housing the rituals that connect their community to the cosmic bargain that ensures divine protection and earthly prosperity. Autumn approaches, and the date palms that line the canals begin to show their ripening fruit. The city prepares for the festivals that mark the end of another agricultural year and the renewal of divine contracts for the coming cycle. The most important of these celebrations honors Marduk's victory over the forces of chaos, a mythological event that is understood to repeat itself annually and to require human participation to ensure its success. For 11 days, the normal routine of city life gives way to elaborate ceremonies that involve every resident, from the highest temple officials to the humblest field workers. Processions wind through the streets carrying statues of gods and goddesses, while priests recite the epic poems that tell of divine victories over the powers of darkness. Citizens bring their finest offerings to the temples, demonstrating their gratitude for another year of protection and their commitment to continued service in the year ahead. A family of fishermen who work the marshes south of the city travel to Babylon for the festival, bringing with them dried fish and marsh birds that will be offered at the shrine of Enki, the god of the sweet waters who governs their livelihood. The father, Urshanabi, carries his infant son to the temple for a blessing ceremony that will formally acknowledge the child's place within the cosmic order and ensure divine protection for his future life. The ritual connects this moment of personal joy to the larger story of divine human cooperation that began when the cosmic crisis was resolved through the creation of mortally servants. The ceremony takes place in a courtyard filled with other families, seeking similar blessings for their children. The priest who officiates wears robes of fine linen and carries a staff of polished wood topped with symbols of his divine patron. His words invoke the original bargain, between gods and humans, reminding the gathered worshippers that their children are born into a world where divine favour must be earned through faithful service and proper ritual observance. During the winter months, when the agricultural work slackens and the river flows quietly between its banks, the focus of divine service shifts to the preservation and transmission of sacred knowledge. This is the season when scribes work most intensively on copying the tablets that contain the myths, prayers, and legal codes that govern relations between heaven and earth. The stories of the Igigi rebellion and the cosmic crisis that led to human creation are among the most important texts copied during this period, for they provide the theological foundation that justifies the entire system of divine service. An elderly scribe named Berossus spends his days in a chamber deep within the temple complex, copying portions of the Atrahasis epic onto tablets that will be distributed to other cities throughout the region. His fingers, gnarled with age but still steady from decades of practice, move across the clay surface with the precision that comes only from a lifetime of preserving sacred knowledge. The story he copies speaks of divine negotiations that took place in the highest heaven, but its themes resonate in every human heart that seeks to understand the purpose of earthly life and the source of cosmic order. Training of young scribes during these winter months ensures that the sacred knowledge will survive into future generations. Students gather in instruction halls where master teachers explain not only the technical skills of cuneiform writing, but also the theological significance of the text they are learning to preserve. The rebellion of the Igigi becomes a lesson in the importance of accepting one's place within the cosmic hierarchy. While the divine solution that created humanity demonstrates the wisdom of the gods in establishing a system that serves the needs of all participants. A student named Nabu Nasir listens attentively as his teacher explains the significance of the divine labour crisis that preceded human creation. The story teaches that even gods must sometimes negotiate the terms of cosmic order, that justice requires consideration for those who bear the burdens of maintaining universal stability. Yet, it also demonstrates that challenges to divine authority must be resolved through wisdom and compromise, rather than rebellion and destruction. Lesson applies not only to the relationship between gods and humans, but also to the social order that governs relations among mortals themselves. The daily routine of temple service reflects the cosmic principle established when humanity accepted its role as divine servant. Each morning's offerings renew the bargain that provides humans with the protection and prosperity they need for survival, while each evening's prayers acknowledge dependence on powers that transcend mortal understanding. The ritual calendar that governs these observances follows the same seasonal patterns that the gods established when they first organized the cosmic order, connecting human time to the eternal rhythms that govern all existence. In the residential quarters of the city, ordinary families maintain their own versions of temple worship, creating household shrines that honor the gods who govern their particular circumstances and occupations. Weaver named Demik Ilishu keeps a small figure of the goddess Ninlil beside her loom, offering prayers and small gifts that invoke divine blessing on her work. Textiles she creates will eventually find their way to temple ceremonies and households of the wealthy, connecting her labour to the larger system of divine service that gives meaning and purpose to human existence. The beer that accompanies most meals is understood to be more than simple refreshment, for the grain from which it is brewed and the water used in its preparation are both gifts from gods who could withdraw their favour if mortals proved ungrateful or disobedient. Cup, raised in friendship or celebration, acknowledges divine generosity, while the social bonds formed through shared drinking reflect the cosmic harmony that results from faithful acceptance of divine authority. As the seasons turn, and the cycle of flood and planting, growth and harvest repeats itself, year after year the city maintains its place within the larger cosmic order through the accumulated faithfulness of countless individual acts of worship and obedience. The temples that dominate the skyline serve as constant reminders of humanity's cosmic purpose, while the daily rituals that take place within their walls renew the ancient bargain that ensures divine protection for earthly life. The arrangement that resolved the celestial crisis of divine labour has become so thoroughly integrated into human existence that few question its basic assumptions. The gods require worship and service. Humans provide these necessities in exchange for protection and prosperity, and the cosmic order remains stable through the faithful performance of ritual obligations by both divine and mortal participants. The system works because it addresses the legitimate needs of all parties, preventing labour disputes that once threatened the stability of heaven itself. Yet beneath the surface of this apparently stable arrangement, subtle tensions continue to develop that will eventually challenge the comfortable assumptions of divine human cooperation. The very success of the system creates new pressures and possibilities that the original cosmic negotiators may not have fully anticipated. Human cities grow larger and more complex, developing their own centres of power that sometimes compete with temple authority. Trade networks spread across ever wider regions, bringing different peoples into contact with alternative approaches to divine service. Knowledge accumulates in temple libraries and scribal schools, creating a class of educated specialists who begin to ask sophisticated questions about the nature of cosmic order and divine authority. The sun sets behind the massive walls of Babylon as another day of faithful service draws toward its close. The evening offerings have been made. The temple fires burn steadily in their bronze braziers, and the citizens settle into the quiet routines that mark the transition from day to night. The cosmic bargain that began with the rebellion of the Igigi continues to function smoothly, providing structure and meaning for human existence, while ensuring that divine purposes are served through mortal cooperation. Tomorrow will bring its own cycle of worship and work, renewal and reaffirmation, as the ancient contract between heaven and earth maintains its steady rhythm through another turning of the seasonal wheel. Stars that emerge in the darkening sky follow the same paths that were established when the cosmic order was first organized, their movements governed by divine laws that transcend human understanding, yet serve human purposes by marking the passage of time and the approach of seasonal changes. People who watch these stellar movements from their rooftops and courtyards inherit the legacy of the great cosmic crisis, the divine rebellion, that led to their own creation as servants of supernatural powers. Their existence testifies to the wisdom of the gods in resolving that ancient conflict through negotiation and innovation rather than punishment and destruction, creating a stable foundation for the ongoing cooperation between heaven and earth that sustains all life and gives meaning to the human journey through time. The stories that had emerged from the cosmic crisis did not remain unchanged as they spread across the growing network of Mesopotamian cities, for each temple center brought its own perspective to the ancient narratives, reshaping them to reflect local loyalties and political realities. What had begun as a unified account of divine rebellion and cosmic resolution, gradually developed into multiple versions, each emphasizing different aspects of the original story and highlighting the roles of different gods according to the theological priorities of particular cities and dynasties. The scribes who copied these narratives understood that they were not merely preserving neutral historical records, but maintaining living traditions that justified contemporary arrangements of power and authority, both divine and earthly. In the great city of Nippur, which maintained its status as a religious centre even as political authority shifted among rival dynasties, the scribes who preserved the creation myths emphasized the central role of Enlil, the air god whose temple dominated the sacred quarter and whose blessing was essential for any ruler's legitimacy. Their versions of the Igigi rebellion focused on Enlil's wisdom in resolving the crisis, presenting him as the divine executive whose careful management of celestial politics had prevented cosmic catastrophe and established the stable order that benefited both gods and mortals. Picture the temple school at Nippur on a winter morning, when the Tigris runs low between its banks and the bare fields stretch brown and quiet under the pale sky. The master scribe, Enlil Bani, gathers his students in the main instruction hall, where tablets containing the authorized version of the creation epic wait to be copied onto fresh clay. The version he teaches presents Enlil as the primary architect of the divine solution, the god whose understanding of both cosmic law and practical necessity enabled him to craft the agreement that satisfied the legitimate complaints of the Igigi while maintaining essential divine authority. The students who copy this text learn that Enlil's role in resolving the celestial crisis demonstrates his fitness to serve as the supreme authority over earthly affairs. When human kings seek legitimacy for their rule, they must journey to Nippur to receive Enlil's blessing. Acknowledging that their power derives ultimately from the god who once negotiated the cosmic settlement that made mortal civilization possible, the creation myth thus becomes a charter for Nippur's continued religious authority, regardless of which city might hold temporary political dominance in the region 200 miles downstream. In the ancient city of Eridu, near the shores of the Persian Gulf, the temple scribes preserved very different versions of the basic story. Here, where the god Enki was understood to dwell in the sweet waters that lay beneath the earth, the creation myths emphasized his role as the divine patron of wisdom and human welfare. In these versions, Enki emerged as the true hero of the cosmic crisis, the god whose compassion for the suffering Igigi led him to propose the creative solution that preserved cosmic order while addressing divine grievances. An elderly priestess named Ninkala walks through the marshy gardens that surround Enki's temple, gathering reeds that will be dried and shaped into the styluses used for cuneiform writing. The landscape here speaks of the god's association with life-giving water and the fertility that makes civilization possible. Canals and irrigation channels web the countryside, carrying the sweet water that Enki provides from his underground domain to the fields where barley and dates grow in abundance, despite the salt marshes that stretch toward the distant sea. The version of the creation epic preserved in Eridu's library presents Enki as the divine advocate for both the Igigi workers and the humans who were eventually created to resolve their grievances. This theological emphasis serves the political interests of Eridu's priesthood, who claim special authority in matters of divine wisdom and human welfare. When disputes arise between cities or dynasties, Eridu's priests position themselves as mediators whose understanding of Enki's compassionate nature enables them to craft solutions that serve the interests of all parties. The differences between these regional versions extend beyond simple emphasis to fundamental questions about the nature of divine authority and the purpose of human existence. Pu's scribes present humanity's creation as primarily serving the administrative needs of cosmic government, emphasizing obedience to properly constituted authority as the essential human virtue. Erid's tradition focuses more on the relationship between divine wisdom and human welfare, suggesting that the gods' primary concern is the flourishing of their mortal servants rather than mere ritual compliance. As political power shifted among the various city-states that controlled different portions of the river valleys, these theological differences took on increasingly important practical implications. King, who claimed divine mandate from Enlil of Nippur, faced different expectations and limitations than one who traced his authority to Enki of Eridu. The creation myths that justified these competing claims shaped not only religious observance but also legal codes, military policies, and diplomatic relations between rival dynasties. The rise of Babylon as a major political center during the early second millennium before our era brought yet another perspective to the ancient narratives. The city's patron god Marduk had originally been a relatively minor figure in the Mesopotamian pantheon, but as Babylon's political influence grew, its scribes developed increasingly elaborate myths that positioned Marduk as the supreme cosmic authority whose power transcended that of the older generation of gods. In the great temple complex that dominated central Babylon, scribes worked to create a new version of the creation epic that would reflect their city's growing importance. The Enuma Elish, as modern scholars call this text, retold the story of cosmic organization in terms that emphasized Marduk's role as the champion of order against chaos, the divine hero whose victory over primordial forces established him as the rightful ruler of both heaven and earth. A young scribe named Nabu Apla Idina works late into the evening in his chamber within Marduk's temple, copying portions of the Enuma Elish onto tablets that will eventually be distributed to other cities throughout Babylon's growing empire. The oil lamp beside his work table casts flickering light on the cuneiform signs that tell of Marduk's cosmic victory, his assumption of supreme authority among the gods, and his establishment of Babylon as the center of both divine and earthly government. This version of the creation story significantly modifies the earlier traditions about Igigi rebellion and cosmic labor, while acknowledging the basic framework of the older myths. The Enuma Elish presents Marduk as the god who ultimately resolved all divine conflicts and established the final cosmic order that governs present existence. The Igigi and Anunnaki appear in this narrative as subordinate figures whose roles were defined by Marduk's supreme authority, rather than by the negotiations among equals that characterized earlier versions of the story. The political implications of this theological revision were profound and immediate. As Babylon extended its control over other Mesopotamian cities, its scribes carried the Enuma Elish to temple libraries throughout the region, gradually displacing or supplementing the older local traditions. Kings, who ruled in Marduk's name, could claim authority that transcended the traditional city-based loyalties that characterized earlier periods, appealing instead to cosmic principles that applied universally to all human societies. The process of theological revision was not always smooth or uncontested. In cities with strong local traditions and established priesthoods, the introduction of Babylonian religious texts sometimes provoked resistance from scribes and priests, who saw their own authority threatened by the new narratives, competition between different versions of the creation myths, thus reflected broader political struggles between centralizing imperial powers and traditional local autonomy. Traveling merchant named Shamash Hazir experiences these theological tensions firsthand as he conducts business across the various city-states of the region. Food. In where the moon god Nana maintains his ancient temple, the priests speak of cosmic order in terms that emphasize the cyclical nature of divine authority, the regular alternation of power that follows celestial patterns visible in the phases of the moon. Their creation myths present the resolution of the Igigi crisis as one episode in an ongoing cycle of divine negotiation and renewal. When his trading ventures take him north to Ashur, the religious center of the growing Assyrian kingdom, he encounters yet another perspective on the ancient stories. Here the scribes have adapted the creation myths to emphasize the role of the war god Ashur, presenting him as the divine champion whose military prowess established and maintains cosmic order. The rebellion of the Igigi becomes, in this version, a prototype for all the earthly conflicts that threaten civilized existence. While Ashur's role in its resolution justifies the aggressive military policies that Assyrian kings pursue in his name, these regional variations in mythological emphasis create practical challenges for merchants, diplomats, and other travelers who must navigate between different political systems with their own theological justifications. Contract that invokes the blessing of Marduk might not be recognized in a city that maintains exclusive loyalty to Enlil, while a legal dispute that is resolved according to Enki's principles of compassionate wisdom might not be accepted in a region that prioritizes Ashur's martial virtues. Scribes who preserve and transmit these competing traditions understand that they are engaged in more than scholarly activity. Their choice of which version to copy, which details to emphasize, which theological interpretations to include, directly affects the political legitimacy of the rulers they serve and the religious authority of the temples that employ them. The ancient story of cosmic rebellion thus continues to shape contemporary politics, as different groups use different versions of the myth to justify their particular claims to power and authority. During the summer months, when trade expeditions travel the river routes that connect the various city-states, caravans often carry not only commercial goods, but also copies of religious texts that reflect the theological perspectives of their home regions. Boat, loaded with Babylonian textiles, might also transport tablets containing the Enuma Elish, while a shipment of metal goods from Assyrian territories could include copies of creation myths that emphasize Ashur's cosmic authority. Priests who receive these texts face delicate decisions about how to incorporate foreign religious materials into their own temple libraries. Some maintain strict separation, preserving local traditions unchanged, while acknowledging the political necessity of keeping foreign texts available for reference. Others attempt synthesis, creating new versions that combine elements from different traditions in ways that preserve local autonomy while accommodating imperial pressures. An experienced librarian named Nebo Akishar spends his days organizing the manuscript collection at the Temple of Shamash in the city of Sippar, where tablets from many different regions and time periods have accumulated over the centuries. His shelves contain multiple versions of the creation epic, each reflecting the theological and political priorities of its place and time of origin. The variations in detail provide insight into how the ancient story of divine rebellion has been adapted to serve different contemporary purposes. Some versions emphasize the justice of the Igiji's complaints, presenting their rebellion as a legitimate response to unfair treatment that required divine correction. These texts tend to come from cities where merchants and craftsmen hold significant political influence, reflecting social systems that place high value on fair treatment for all productive members of society. Other versions focus on the disorder that resulted from divine insubordination, using the cosmic crisis as a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging properly constituted authority. The most sophisticated texts attempt to balance these competing emphases, presenting the Igigi rebellion as both understandable and problematic, requiring divine wisdom to resolve in ways that address legitimate grievances while maintaining essential cosmic order. These nuanced versions often emerge from major temple centers, where scholarly priests have the time and resources needed for careful theological reflection, creating narratives that serve the political needs of their patrons while preserving intellectual coherence and spiritual depth. The seasonal festivals that mark the agricultural year provide regular opportunities for different theological traditions to interact and sometimes compete for popular acceptance. During the spring celebration of the new year, when creation myths are recited as part of the renewal ceremonies, priests must decide which version of the ancient stories to present to gathered worshippers. Their choices can reinforce existing political loyalties or subtly encourage alternative allegiances, making these religious observances important tools of both cultural preservation and political influence. Festival coordinator named Nergal Ushezib oversees the spring ceremonies in a prosperous market town that lies at the intersection of trade routes serving several major cities. Population includes merchants and craftsmen loyal to different political centers, creating a complex audience for religious observances that must acknowledge multiple theological traditions without favoring any single version so obviously as to cause offense or conflict. His solution involves presenting excerpts from several different creation myths in the course of the festival, allowing worshippers to hear familiar versions while being exposed to alternative perspectives. Cosmic story of Igigi rebellion and divine resolution thus becomes a unifying narrative that transcends political boundaries, even as its various interpretations continue to serve the distinct interests of different communities and rulers. The influence of these competing mythological traditions extends beyond formal religious observances to shape popular culture and everyday social relationships. Craftsman, who has learned creation stories that emphasize divine cooperation and fair treatment, approaches his work relationships differently than one who has absorbed narratives that prioritize obedience to authority. The cosmic myths that explain human origins thus continue to influence mortal behavior thousands of years after the events they purport to describe. In the workshops and marketplaces where ordinary citizens pursue their daily occupations, conversations often touch on questions that relate directly to the theological disputes preserved in temple libraries. When workers discuss fair wages or appropriate treatment by their superiors, they frequently invoke principles derived from creation myths about divine labor and cosmic justice. The ancient rebellion of the Igigi becomes a reference point for understanding contemporary social relationships, while the divine resolution of that crisis provides models for addressing present conflicts. Potter named Sinleki Unnini employs both apprentices and journeymen in his workshop, creating vessels that serve both practical and ceremonial purposes. His approach to managing these work relationships reflects his understanding of the creation myths he learned during his youth in the temple school at Uruk, where Enlil's role in resolving divine labor disputes was presented as a model for earthly management practices. He believes that employers have obligations to their workers that correspond to the cosmic responsibilities that higher gods bear toward their divine subordinates. When disputes arise in his workshop, he often resolves them by reference to the principles embedded in the ancient myths, explaining that just as the gods found ways to address the legitimate grievances of the Igigi Guakao Igigi workers while maintaining cosmic order, so earthly supervisors must balance the needs of their employees with the requirements of productive labor. This approach to workplace relations reflects a broader pattern of applying mythological insights to practical social problems, demonstrating how ancient religious narratives continue to shape contemporary human behavior. Competition between different versions of the creation myths thus operates on multiple levels, simultaneously, influencing everything from imperial policy to neighborhood relationships. The story that began with cosmic rebellion and divine negotiation has become a living tradition that continues to evolve as each generation finds new applications for its insights into the proper relationships between authority and service, divine justice and cosmic order, individual grievances and collective stability. Autumn approaches and the date harvest begins, bringing another cycle of agricultural abundance that testifies to the success of the ancient cosmic settlement. The various theological traditions continue their complex dance of competition and cooperation. Tribes who preserve these narratives understand that they are maintaining not merely historical records but dynamic resources for understanding and managing the ongoing challenges of social existence in a world where divine and mortal interests must somehow be balanced. Evening light fades behind the great ziggurats that mark the major cities of the region, their stepped side and climbing toward the star-filled sky, where the ancient gods once negotiated the terms that govern present existence. The stories preserved in their temple libraries speak of a time when even heaven itself was not free from conflict, when divine workers challenged cosmic authority and forced the creation of new arrangements that would satisfy all parties to the celestial dispute. These narratives continue to resonate because they address universal questions about work and reward, duty and justice, that face every human society in every generation. Tomorrow will bring new challenges that test the wisdom of the ancient settlements, new pressures that require fresh applications of the principles established when the cosmic order was reorganized to address divine rebellion. Myths that preserve the memory of that primordial negotiation remain available to guide contemporary responses, their competing versions offering different perspective, eternal questions of authority and service that shape relationships between rulers and subjects, employers and workers, gods and mortals, throughout the ongoing human journey through time. The cosmic settlement that had resolved the ancient crisis of divine labor carried within itself the seeds of an even greater challenge, one that would test whether the arrangement between heaven and earth could survive the unintended consequences of its own success. For countless generations after humans were created to serve the gods and relieve the Igigi of their burdensome cosmic duties, the new system functioned exactly as its divine architects had intended. Mortal servants faithfully maintained the temples that housed their supernatural masters, offered the daily sacrifices that provided divine sustenance, and performed the ritual observances that kept the cosmic machinery running smoothly. The gods, in return, blessed human endeavours with fertility and prosperity, protecting their servant communities from the force of chaos that constantly threatened to overwhelm the ordered world. Yet this very success began to create pressures that the original cosmic negotiators had not fully anticipated. Human populations grew rapidly under divine protection, spreading across the fertile valleys between the rivers and establishing new settlements wherever water and arable land made agriculture possible. Cities expanded beyond their original boundaries, developing complex social hierarchies and economic systems that required increasingly sophisticated forms of organization and control. The noise and activity of human civilization began to fill the earth, rising from countless communities toward the heavens where the gods dwelt in their eternal councils. Picture the great city of Shurapak during the height of its prosperity. Perhaps 4.5 millennia before our own time, the settlement sprawls along both banks of the Euphrates, its residential quarters extending far beyond the original temple precinct to accommodate a population that numbers in the tens of thousands. Smoke rises from thousands of cooking fires, workshops where craftsmen shape metal and clay into ever more elaborate forms, and kilns where potters fire the vessels that serve both sacred and secular purposes. The sound of human activity fills the air from before dawn until well after sunset. The voices of children at play, merchants calling their wares in crowded marketplaces, the rhythmic hammering of smiths, and the creaking of carts carrying goods along streets that never seem to rest. The abundance that divine favour has brought to this community is visible everywhere. Warehouses bulge with surplus grain from harvests that consistently exceed what the population requires for immediate survival. Shops display exotic goods imported from distant regions, testimony to trade networks that connect Shurapak to settlements hundreds of miles away. Houses of prosperous merchants and successful craftsmen rise 2 and even 3 stories above street, their mud brick walls decorated with glazed tiles and carved reliefs that demonstrate their owners' wealth and status within the community. The temple quarter that still dominates the city centre. The daily routines of divine service have expanded to accommodate the growing complexity of human society. Where once a handful of priests could manage all the necessary rituals, now dozens of religious specialists maintain the elaborate ceremonial calendar that connects earthly prosperity to cosmic blessing. The offerings that citizens bring to honour their divine protectors have grown correspondingly lavish, reflecting the material abundance that faithful service has earned and the competitive displays of wealth that mark successful urban communities. A high priestess named Ninlil Zimu oversees the morning ceremonies in the temple of the river goddess, where the day begins with offerings that would have amazed the modest farming communities that first established this settlement. Golden vessels hold the choicest cuts of meat from specially raised cattle, while silver bowls contain delicacies imported from across the known world. Honey from mountain regions where wild bees nest in rocky crevices, spices from desert trading posts where caravans rest on their journeys between distant civilizations, fruits from orchards that grow in climates far different from the river valleys of Mesopotamia. Ritual chamber where these offerings are arranged could house an entire family from the early agricultural settlements that preceded the city's growth. Walls of polished stone rise to meet a ceiling decorated with representations of the cosmic order that humanity serves, while floors of fitted limestone create geometric patterns that reflect divine mathematical principles. The statue of the goddess herself, carved from stone, quarried in distant mountains, and transported at enormous expense down the river channels, stands nearly twice the height of a mortal worshipper, its surface inlaid with precious metals and gems that catch the light of bronze lamps burning the finest cedar oil. Yet, even as this elaborate displays testifies to the success of the cosmic arrangement between gods and mortals, it also reveals subtle tensions that are beginning to strain the foundations of that ancient settlement. Very abundance that divine favour has made possible has created new forms of human behaviour that the gods did not anticipate when they first agreed to accept mortal service in place of Igigi labour. Repetitive accumulation of wealth, the complex social hierarchies that mark urban civilization, the constant noise and activity of dense human populations. All of these represent developments that emerged from the cosmic bargain, but were not explicitly included in its original terms. In the residential quarters beyond the temple precinct, the daily life of ordinary citizens reflects both the benefits and the complications of living under divine protection in an increasingly complex society. A successful merchant named Ziusudra manages a household that includes not only his immediate family, but also numerous servants, apprentices, and dependents whose welfare depends on his continued prosperity. The house where they live contains rooms designated for specific purposes, chambers for sleeping, areas for food preparation and consumption, workshops where various crafts are practiced, storage spaces for the goods that constitute his wealth, and a private shrine where household rituals maintain his family's relationship with their protective deities. The morning routine that begins each day in this prosperous household would have been unimaginable to the simple farming families that first established human settlements in the river valleys. Servants rise before dawn to light the fires that will cook elaborate meals, clean and maintain the various rooms that serve different functions, and prepare the household for another day of complex social and economic activity. The master and his family dress in garments made from fine materials and decorated according to the latest fashions that mark their status within the community, while breakfast consists of foods that represent the agricultural abundance that divine favour has made possible. The children who grow up in this environment learn to take for granted luxuries that their ancestors could not have imagined. They play with toys carved from exotic woods and precious stones, wear clothing dyed with expensive pigments, and eat foods that combine ingredients from across the known world. Their education includes not only the basic skills needed for literacy and religious observance, but also the complex social knowledge required for navigation within an urban community, where relationships between different families and groups require careful attention to status, obligation, and mutual advantage. Yet, this prosperity comes with costs that gradually become apparent as the generations pass. The competitive accumulation of wealth that drives urban economic activity creates increasing disparities between rich and poor, successful and unsuccessful, powerful and dependent. Complex social hierarchies that organize urban communities require constant attention to maintain stability, consuming time and energy that previous generations devoted entirely to practical, productive activities. Significantly, the sheer scale and intensity of human activity begins to generate forms of environmental pressure that threaten the natural foundations on which all civilization ultimately depends. Autumn arrives, and the annual flood cycle brings the Euphrates to its seasonal peak. The citizens of Shurupak prepare for the familiar routine of temporary evacuation that allows the fields to receive their annual deposit of of fertile silt. But this year the waters rise higher than anyone can remember, overflowing the channels and canals that normally contain the seasonal flooding and spreading across areas that have been permanently settled for generations. Houses that were built on ground considered safely above flood level find themselves surrounded by water that shows no sign of receding according to the usual seasonal schedule. The crisis develops gradually at first. As unusual but not unprecedented, flooding disrupts normal routines without creating immediate panic. Families who live closest to the main river channel move their possessions to higher ground and take temporary shelter with relatives or friends whose houses occupy more elevated positions. Merchants adjust their trading schedules to accommodate the temporary closure of river transport routes, while farmers wait patiently for the waters to recede so that they can assess damage to crops and irrigation systems. But as days turn into weeks and the floodwaters continue to rise, rather than beginning their expected retreat, the situation transforms from temporary inconvenience into genuine catastrophe. The seasonal pattern that has governed agricultural life for countless generations breaks down as divine forces that once brought predictable fertility now deliver unpredictable destruction. Cosmic order that seemed so stable and beneficial reveals itself to be subject to divine decisions that mortals can neither predict nor control. An elderly priest named Atrahasis, keeper of the most ancient flood records preserved in the temple archives, spends his days consulting tablets that describe previous instances of unusual flooding, seeking precedents that might explain the current crisis and guidance for appropriate responses. Texts he studies speak of irregular flood cycles that occasionally disrupt normal patterns, but nothing in the historical record approaches the scale and duration of the current emergency. The waters that now cover most of the settled areas around Shurupak show no signs of following any previously observed pattern. The religious implications of this unprecedented flooding prove even more disturbing than its practical consequences. According to the theological understanding that has guided human civilization since its beginning, natural disasters represent either tests of mortal faithfulness that can be passed through proper ritual observance, or punishment for failures in divine service that can be corrected through appropriate repentance and increased offerings. The current crisis resists interpretation. According to either of these familiar categories, the citizens of Shurupak have not failed in their ritual obligations to the gods. Anything. Their increasing prosperity has enabled them to offer more elaborate and expensive sacrifices than any previous generation, demonstrating their gratitude for divine favour and their commitment to maintaining the cosmic bargain that ensures continued protection. The temples have been maintained and expanded according to the highest standards of craftsmanship and artistic achievement, while the priesthood has grown in both numbers and expertise to meet the religious needs of the expanding population. Yet the divine response to this faithful service was to be not blessing, but catastrophe, not protection, but destruction on a scale that threatens the very survival of the human communities that have flourished under the cosmic arrangement established when the Igigi rebellion was resolved through mortal service. Theological foundation that has supported human civilization begins to crack under the pressure of events that cannot be explained according to traditional understanding of divine justice and cosmic order. Council of senior priests gathers in the highest chamber of the great ziggurat, the only building in the city that still rises completely above the surrounding floodwaters. Through the small windows of their meeting place, they can see the submerged neighbourhoods where families have lived for generations. The workshops where craftsmen created the goods that sustained urban prosperity. The marketplaces where merchants gathered to exchange products from across the known world. All of this evidence of human achievement and divine favour now lies beneath waters that continue to rise despite their most earnest prayers and elaborate offerings. Theological crisis that accompanies the physical emergency forces these religious leaders to confront questions that challenge the fundamental assumptions of their worldview. The gods just. Why do the faithful suffer alongside the unfaithful? The cosmic bargain ensures divine protection in exchange for proper service. Why has exemplary human performance resulted in unprecedented disaster? Disturbing of all. If the arrangement that resolved the ancient Igigi rebellion was supposed to create permanent stability in the relationship between heaven and earth, why does that relationship now seem to be breaking down in ways that threaten the very existence of the mortal servants who were created to maintain it? The tablets that preserve the most ancient wisdom about divine human relations speak of various divine councils where cosmic policy is debated and decided. According to these texts, the gods do not act capriciously, but make decisions based on careful consideration of universal principles and long-term consequences. Yet, the current crisis suggests either that divine decision-making has become less rational and predictable, or that the original cosmic settlement contained flaws that have only now become apparent as its unintended consequences accumulate beyond manageable levels. Among the various explanations that the priestly council considers, one proves particularly troubling, because it implies that the fault for the current crisis lies not with human failure, but with divine miscalculation. According to this interpretation, the gods who originally agreed to accept human service in place of Igigi labour failed to anticipate how successful that arrangement would prove to be. Human populations have grown far beyond what the divine planners expected, creating levels of activity and complexity that strain the very foundations of cosmic order. The constant noise of human civilization may have become unbearable to divine beings who value the quiet contemplation that accompanies eternal existence. Competitive accumulation of wealth that drives urban prosperity may conflict with divine principles of cosmic harmony and balanced distribution of resources. Most significantly, the rapid growth of human populations may threaten to overwhelm the Earth's capacity to support complex life, creating environmental pressures that endanger the natural foundations on which both divine and mortal existence ultimately depends. If this analysis proves correct, then the current crisis represents not divine punishment for human failure, but divine correction of their own earlier policy decisions. Cosmic settlement that resolved the Igigi rebellion may need to be fundamentally revised or even completely abandoned, with consequences for human civilization that are too devastating to contemplate. The floods that now threaten Shurapak, and presumably other human settlements throughout the region, may be the beginning of a divine decision to reduce human populations to levels that the gods consider manageable and sustainable. A younger priest named Utnapishtim listens to these theological discussions with growing alarm, not only because of their implications for immediate survival, but also because of what they suggest about the reliability of divine commitments. If the gods can reconsider and revise fundamental cosmic arrangements when their consequences prove inconvenient, then no human institution or achievement can be considered permanently secure. Temples, cities, trade networks, and cultural traditions that represent thousands of years of accumulated human effort could all be swept away if divine preferences shift in directions that require dramatic population reduction or complete reorganization of earthly society. Practical preparations for survival that accompany these theological debates reflect the unprecedented nature of the crisis facing human civilization. Previous floods, even unusually severe ones, could be managed through temporary evacuation and patient reconstruction once the waters receded. Current disaster shows no signs of following familiar patterns, requiring preparations for possibilities that no previous generation has faced. Permanent abandonment of established settlements, preservation of essential knowledge and resources during extended periods of chaos, and the possibility that entire ways of life may need to be recreated from scattered survivors. Temple archives that contain the accumulated wisdom of human civilization become a particular focus of preservation efforts. Scribes work desperately to copy the most essential texts onto tablets that can be sealed in waterproof containers, ensuring that future generations will retain access to the religious, legal, and technical knowledge that has been developed over centuries of cultural evolution. The creation myths that tell of the Igigi rebellion and the cosmic settlement that led to human creation take priority in these preservation efforts, for they contain the theological foundation that any future human society will need to understand its place in the cosmic order. Among the texts that receive special attention during these emergency copying efforts are the prophecies and divination records that provide guidance for interpreting divine intentions during periods of crisis. These ancient sources speak of various cosmic cycles that govern the relationship between heaven and earth, suggesting that even the most stable arrangements may be subject to periodic revision as universal conditions change and divine priorities evolve. The current crisis may represent one of these periodic adjustments, requiring human adaptation to new cosmic circumstances rather than simple restoration of previous conditions. Floodwaters continued their relentless rise, and the familiar landmarks of human civilization disappear beneath the expanding deluge. The survivors who have found temporary refuge on the highest ground face decisions that will determine not only their immediate fate, but also the future direction of human development. Cosmic bargain that has sustained mortal civilization since its beginning, requiring either its fundamental renegotiation or complete replacement with new arrangements that take into account the lessons learned from its unexpected failure. The gods who once seemed so stable and predictable in their support for human endeavours now reveal themselves as cosmic forces whose long-term intentions remain mysterious, and whose commitment to any particular arrangement may be subject to revision without advance warning. The relationship between heaven and earth that seemed permanently settled through the resolution of the ancient Igigi crisis now appears to be entering a new phase of uncertainty and negotiation, with consequences that will reshape the fundamental conditions of mortal existence. The evening light fades behind clouds heavy with the moisture that continues to fall as rain, adding to the floodwaters that have already transformed the familiar landscape into an unrecognizable expanse of muddy sea. The sounds of human activity that once filled the air from dawn to dusk have been replaced by the endless whisper of wind across water, broken only by the occasional call of birds that circle overhead in search of dry ground that no longer exists. The cosmic crisis that began with excessive human success has reached a point where Survival itself requires abandoning everything that the previous generations achieved and starting over with only the essential knowledge needed to maintain the basic relationship between mortals and their divine masters. Tomorrow will bring new challenges that test whether any human community can survive the breakdown of cosmic arrangements that seemed as permanent as the rivers themselves. New pressures that require fresh understanding of divine intentions and mortal limitations. Great experiment in cosmic cooperation that began with the rebellion of the Igigi and led to human creation as a solution to divine labor problems, now faces its greatest test. The gods reconsider whether their mortal servants have become more trouble than they are worth, and whether the entire arrangement needs fundamental revision or complete abandonment in favor of alternative approaches to maintaining universal order. The decision that would reshape the fundamental relationship between heaven and earth was made not in anger, but in the kind of weary resignation that comes when even the wisest plans reveal unintended consequences that threaten the very foundations they were meant to preserve. In the highest council of the gods, where the supreme powers gathered to consider cosmic policy, the discussion had continued for what mortals would measure as months while the waters rose steadily across the inhabited earth. Enlil, whose authority over earthly affairs made him responsible for managing the consequences of human proliferation, argued with increasing urgency that the situation had moved beyond any possibility of gradual correction. The noise of human civilization had become unbearable to divine ears, accustomed to the ordered silence of cosmic contemplation. More critically, the rapid expansion of mortal populations threatened to exhaust the Earth's capacity to sustain complex life, creating environmental pressures that could ultimately destabilize the entire created order. The solution that Enlil proposed was both radical and final. A comprehensive flood that would reduce human populations to levels that the Earth could support indefinitely, while eliminating the complex urban civilizations whose competitive accumulation of wealth and power had created the very problems that now threatened cosmic stability. This approach would preserve the basic principle of human service to divine purposes, while preventing the kind of explosive growth that had led to the current crisis. Picture the divine council chamber as described in the ancient texts, a realm beyond mortal understanding where the fundamental laws of existence are debated and decided. Here, in surroundings that transcend physical description, the gods who shaped the cosmos from its beginning face the need to revise their most important policy decisions. The air itself resonates with the gravity of choices that will determine the fate of entire civilizations, while the assembled divine powers weigh options that involve life and death for millions of mortal beings who remain unaware that their continued existence hangs in the balance. Anu, speaking with the supreme authority of highest heaven, acknowledged the wisdom of Enlil's analysis, while expressing concern about the precedent that such drastic action might establish. The original resolution of the Igigi crisis had been presented as a permanent settlement that would ensure cosmic stability for all future generations. That arrangement now required fundamental revision through catastrophic intervention. What confidence could any divine policy command regarding its long-term effectiveness? Gods themselves might find their authority undermined if they appeared unable to anticipate and manage the consequences of their own decisions. Yet the practical pressures that Enlil described could not be ignored or postponed indefinitely. The exponential growth of human populations showed no signs of moderating through internal limitations. while the competitive dynamics that drove urban civilization seemed to intensify rather than diminish as material abundance increased. Environmental indicators suggested that critical thresholds were being approached, beyond which the damage to natural systems might become irreversible, threatening not only human sustainability, but the ecological foundations that supported all earthly life. Enki, whose original proposal to create human servants had provided the solution to the Igigi rebellion, found himself in the difficult position of defending the wisdom of his earlier intervention while acknowledging its problematic consequences. He argued that the current crisis resulted not from fundamental flaws in the concept of human service, but from the gods' failure to provide adequate guidance for managing the success of that arrangement. Humans had fulfilled their cosmic obligations with such effectiveness that they had exceeded all divine expectations, creating abundance and complexity that required new forms of divine supervision rather than catastrophic elimination. The debate that followed would determine not only the immediate fate of human civilization, but also the long-term relationship between heaven and earth for all future generations. Each divine participant brought their own perspective to the discussion, reflecting the different responsibilities and priorities that shaped their understanding of cosmic governance. The air god Enlil focused on maintaining order and preventing chaos. The water god Enki emphasized wisdom and the preservation of life, while Anu weighed all considerations according to the supreme authority that required him to balance competing divine interests against universal stability. As the discussions continued and the floodwaters rose across the inhabited earth, a few perceptive humans began to sense that their world was approaching a transformation beyond anything their ancestors had experienced. In the city of Shuruppak, where the waters had now risen to cover all but the highest buildings, an elderly sage named Atrahasis found himself receiving divine communications that suggested certain preparations might ensure survival for at least some portion of humanity through the coming catastrophe. The god Enki, whose compassionate nature had always made him a protector of human welfare, appears to have decided that total human extinction would represent too drastic a solution to the current problems. While supporting the need for dramatic population reduction, he quietly provided guidance to selected mortals who might preserve essential knowledge and genetic diversity through the approaching deluge. This intervention represented a kind of divine civil disobedience, a decision to moderate the severity of the solution that his fellow gods had endorsed, and while maintaining nominal compliance with their overall policy direction. The instructions that Atrahasis received through dreams and omens were both specific and urgent. Construct a vessel large enough to house representatives of all the various life forms that inhabited the earth. Stock it with sufficient provisions to survive an extended period when normal food production would be impossible. Prepare for flooding that would exceed anything in recorded history or oral tradition. The guidance came wrapped in symbolic language that provided plausible deniability if other gods questioned Enki's role in enabling human survival. But the practical implications were clear enough to someone who understood both divine communication and the realities of flood survival. The construction of this survival vessel required resources and expertise that could only be assembled through community cooperation, forcing Atrahasis to find ways of organizing collective action without revealing the divine source of his information or the unprecedented scale of the approaching catastrophe. He presented the project as preparation for unusually severe but not historically unprecedented flooding, drawing on his reputation as a wise interpreter of seasonal patterns and agricultural cycles to convince neighbours to contribute labour and materials for what appeared to be an extremely elaborate, but not necessarily irrational precautionary measure. Shipwright named Puzur Amuri supervised the actual construction, working from specifications that seemed oddly detailed for simple flood protection, but not so unusual as to raise obvious questions about their ultimate purpose. The vessel took shape gradually over several months of intensive work, its size and design reflecting the need to accommodate not only human survivors, but also breeding pairs of all the domesticated animals that provided the foundation for agricultural civilization, plus supplies sufficient to sustain this living cargo through an extended period of disruption. The work proceeded against a background of gradually rising waters that lent urgency to construction efforts, while providing apparent justification for the unprecedented scale of the preparations. Citizens, who might otherwise have questioned the wisdom of devoting so much community resources to flood protection, found themselves convinced by the evidence of their senses that unusual measures were indeed appropriate for unusual circumstances. The vessel began to seem less like paranoid over-preparation and more like prudent adaptation to environmental conditions that clearly exceeded normal seasonal variation. As the flood reached levels that forced the abandonment of ground-level buildings and then threatened structures that had been considered safely elevated, the true purpose of Atrahasis' vessel became apparent to those who had participated in its construction, not preparation for temporary evacuation during seasonal flooding, but provision for survival. During the complete transformation of the known world, the replacement of familiar landscapes with an unrecognizable expanse of water that showed no respect for previous boundaries between land and sea. The loading of the survival vessel took place during the final days, when human communities still maintained some semblance of organized social structure, before the rising waters forced complete abandonment of fixed settlements and reduced survival to individual or small group efforts. Pairs of animals were brought aboard according to the divine specifications that Enki had provided, ensuring that genetic diversity would be preserved for eventual repopulation when conditions again became suitable for agricultural civilization. The human survivors who accompanied this living cargo represented not just random individuals who happened to gain access to the vessel, but a carefully selected group that included representatives of the various skills and knowledge bases that would be needed for civilizational reconstruction. Scribes brought copies of the most essential texts. Craftsmen carried the tools and techniques needed for basic manufacturing. Farmers preserved seeds for crops that would need to be replanted when dry land became available again. And priests maintained the religious knowledge that would be essential for re-establishing proper relations with the divine powers. The actual period of universal flooding lasted much longer than any previous water crisis in recorded memory, stretching through seasons that would normally have brought the retreat of seasonal inundation and the renewal of agricultural activity. Familiar rhythm of flood and planting, growth and harvest that had governed human life for countless generations simply ceased to function as the waters continued rising, until they covered even the highest hills and most elevated buildings that had marked the landscape since the beginning of settlement. For the survivors confined within the vessel that had become their entire world, this period brought unique challenges that tested both their practical resources and their psychological endurance. Supplies that had seemed adequate for extended emergency proved barely sufficient for survival through flooding that exceeded all previous experience, while the cramped conditions and constant uncertainty created tensions that required careful management. The breakdown of social cooperation among people who depended absolutely on each other for survival. Atrahasis found himself serving not only as the vessel's captain, but also as its priest and judge, responsible for maintaining both the practical routines that kept the floating community functioning and the ritual observances that preserved their kin to the divine powers who had caused their predicament. The daily prayers and offerings that had once been performed in elaborate temple settings now took place in improvised sacred spaces, within a structure that was primarily functional shelter. Yet their importance seemed greater than ever as the only remaining link to the cosmic order that had sustained human civilization. Theological questions that arose during this period of isolation and uncertainty proved as challenging as the practical problems of survival. The gods had decided that human civilization required such drastic correction. What did this mean for the cosmic bargain that had justified mortal existence since its beginning? Could the arrangement that had resolved the ancient Igigi rebellion be restored after such devastating divine intervention? Or would entirely new terms need to be negotiated for any future relationship between heaven and earth? Texts that the scribes had preserved spoke of various divine councils and policy decisions that shaped cosmic governance, but none addressed situations quite like the current crisis. Previous instances of divine intervention in human affairs had been temporary corrections that restored normal conditions. Disruption, not brief periods of vision, not comprehensive transformations that eliminated entire civilizations and required starting over from minimal surviving populations. The survivors faced not only the practical challenge of physical survival, but also the intellectual challenge of understanding their place in a cosmic order that seemed to have fundamentally changed while they watched helplessly from their floating refuge. As the months of universal flooding gradually extended into what would have been multiple agricultural seasons under normal circumstances, subtle changes began to suggest that the divine policy of comprehensive correction might be approaching its intended conclusion. The rains that had added to the rising waters became less frequent and intense, while the constant expansion of the flooded area seemed to stabilize rather than continuing indefinitely. Gunast. Most encouragingly, occasional glimpses of distant high ground suggested that the waters might have reached their maximum level and could eventually begin the long process of recession. First clear sign that the flood was entering its final phase came when birds released from the vessel began returning, with evidence of accessible dry land, vegetation that could provide food sources for both human and animal populations. These scouting flights confirmed that while the familiar landscapes of pre-flood civilization had been completely transformed, the basic geographical structure of hills and valleys, rivers and plains had survived under the temporary covering of divine intervention. The earth itself remained capable of supporting renewed human settlement once the waters completed their retreat. Divine decision to end the flood when it had achieved its intended effects, rather than pursuing complete elimination of human life, reflected both practical considerations and theological principles that would shape all future divine-human relations. From a practical standpoint, total human extinction would have eliminated the mortal servants whose labour had originally resolved the Igigi rebellion forcing the gods to either restore the cosmic work arrangements that had led to that earlier crisis, or develop completely new approaches to maintaining universal order. From a theological perspective, the preservation of human survivors demonstrated divine mercy, and the possibility of renewed covenant relationships between heaven and earth. The gradual recession of the floodwaters revealed a world that was both familiar and completely transformed, where the basic geography remained recognizable, but all the accumulated achievements of human civilization had been swept away. The great cities with their temple complexes and ziggurat towers, the extensive irrigation systems that had supported agricultural abundance, the road networks that had connected distant trading partners. All of this infrastructure of civilized life lay buried beneath layers of mud and debris that would take generations to clear away. If indeed it could be restored at all, the survivors who finally disembarked from their floating refuge onto dry ground that seemed solid, after so many months of constant motion, faced the prospect of rebuilding human civilization from its most basic foundations. They possessed the knowledge and skills that had accumulated over centuries of cultural development, but they lacked the physical infrastructure, the accumulated wealth, and the large populations that had made previous achievements possible. Their situation resembled that of the earliest agricultural settlers who had first established permanent communities in the river valleys, except that they carried with them both the wisdom and the warnings that came from having experienced the rise and catastrophic correction of urban civilization. First priority of these founding survivors was re-establishing proper relations with the divine powers whose intervention had both caused their predicament and enabled their survival. The temporary altar that Atrahasis, constructed from stones, gathered near their landing site, served for offerings that expressed both gratitude for preservation and commitment to avoiding the mistakes that had led to the flood. These initial ceremonies set the tone for a renewed divine-human covenant that would need to balance the essential human services that had originally justified mortal creation against the divine concerns about excessive population growth and environmental degradation that had motivated the recent correction. God Enki, whose secret intervention had enabled human survival, officially acknowledged the wisdom of preserving, accepting the need some human servants, while accepting the need for new limitations that would problems that had led to the flood. The arrangement that emerged from these post-flood negotiations represented a modification of the original cosmic settlement rather than its complete replacement, maintaining the basic principle of human service to divine purposes, while adding restrictions and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent excessive growth and environmental damage. A small community that began the slow process of re-establishing human civilizations carried within its collective memory both the achievements and the failures of the previous age, the knowledge of what was possible for human society, and the understanding of what consequences followed when divine limits were exceeded. They would rebuild slowly and carefully, creating new settlements that honoured the gods while respecting the boundaries that had been established. Through such devastating divine intervention, the cosmic bargain that had once seemed permanently settled now revealed itself as a dynamic relationship that required constant attention to maintain balance between human ambitions and divine tolerance. The evening light faded over the transformed landscape where scattered survivors began the patient work of renewal, their small fires marking the first human settlements in a world that had been cleansed and corrected according to divine specifications. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they sought to rebuild civilization within the limitations that had been so dramatically enforced. New opportunities to demonstrate that humans could serve divine purposes without threatening the cosmic order that sustained all life. The great experiment in divine human cooperation that had begun with the rebellion of the Igigi had survived its greatest test, in forms that would have been unrecognizable to the original cosmic negotiators, who first established the terms of mortal existence. The generations that grew up in the shadow of the Great Correction carried within their bones a different understanding of what it meant to live under divine authority, a knowledge earned through catastrophe that would shape humans' civilization for all the millennia to come. The small community of flood survivors gradually expanded into a network of settlements that spread cautiously along the river valleys. Each new village established only after careful consultation of omens and explicit divine approval for its location and size. Explosive growth that had characterized pre-flood civilization was replaced by deliberate expansion that respected the environmental limits, whose violation had brought such devastating consequences. Farmers counted their livestock carefully. Merchants tracked their trade volumes against established quotas, and city planners designed urban areas with maximum population limits that were never exceeded without formal divine permission. This new approach to human development reflected more than simple caution born of recent trauma. Theological understanding that emerged from the flood revised the relationship, establishing principles that would govern Mesopotamian civilization long after the immediate memory of the catastrophe had faded into legendary accounts preserved in temple libraries and recited during seasonal festivals. Picture the settlement of Kish as it develops during the third generation after the flood, perhaps 4 millennia before our own time. The community occupies a site chosen according to strict divine specifications, transmitted through dreams and augury, located where natural drainage patterns minimize flood risk, while providing access to the fertile soils that make agriculture possible. Population has been carefully managed to remain within limits that the local ecosystem can support indefinitely, with immigration controlled through religious ceremonies that evaluate each potential settler's commitment to the new covenant relationship between heaven and earth. The center of this community is dominated not by the massive temple complexes that characterized pre-flood cities, but by a modest shrine complex that emphasizes function over display, serving divine needs without the competitive accumulation of wealth that had contributed to the earlier crisis. The building materials are locally sourced, clay and reed, rather than the exotic stones and precious metals that once demonstrated urban prosperity. While the daily offerings consist of simple agricultural products, rather than the elaborate imported delicacies that had marked the religious excess of previous generations. Priest who serves this community, a man named Etana, whose grandfather survived the flood as a young child, maintains religious observances that carefully balance human gratitude with divine preference for moderation. The morning ceremonies begin before dawn, with prayers that explicitly acknowledge human dependence on divine mercy, while evening rituals conclude with commitments to remain within the population and consumption limits that preserve environmental stability. The calendar of religious festivals follows seasonal patterns that emphasize agricultural cycles and natural rhythms, rather than the competitive displays of wealth that had marked pre-flood urban celebrations. The life of Yoi families within this community reflects the new understanding of human purpose that emerged from the flood experience. A farmer named Gilgamesh tends fields that are rotated carefully to preserve soil fertility, using agricultural techniques that prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term yield maximization. His house contains the basic necessities for comfortable family life without the accumulation of luxury goods that had marked successful households in the previous age, while his children learn crafts and skills that serve community needs rather than individual advancement in competitive markets. Post. The workshops that provide manufactured goods for community use operate according to principles that balance human creativity with divine limits on material accumulation. Potter named Lugalbanda shapes vessels that serve both practical and ceremonial purposes, but his production is regulated according to community needs rather than market demand, ensuring that his work contributes to collective welfare without generating the kind of surplus wealth that could lead to social inequality and competitive consumption. The clay he uses comes from local sources that are managed as sacred resources requiring ritual permission for extraction, while the kilns that fire his pottery burn wood from trees that are harvested according to sustainable forestry practices, overseen by temple authorities. Trade networks that connect these new settlements to each other operate very differently from the extensive commercial systems that characterized pre-flood civilization. Merchants travel between communities carrying goods that serve essential needs rather than luxury markets. Their activities regulated through religious authorities who ensure that commerce contributes to mutual welfare rather than competitive accumulation. A trader named Sargon carries grain from agricultural districts to communities that specialize in crafts or mining. But his profits are limited according to divine standards of fair exchange that prevent the concentration of wealth that could destabilize the social order. Political organization that governs these post-flood communities reflects the theological lessons learned from the Great Catastrophe. Positions are understood as divine appointments that require specific religious qualifications and regular ritual renewal, while secular authority is always subordinated to priestly override that ensures compliance with the environmental and population limits that preserve cosmic stability. The king, who rules the growing confederation of settlements around Kish, holds his power as a temporary steward responsible for implementing divine policy rather than as an autonomous ruler pursuing independent political goals. Royal Council meeting in the modest palace that serves as the administrative centre of this confederation demonstrates how political decision-making has been transformed by the flood experience. The agenda focuses not on military expansion or commercial advantage, but on careful management of population growth and resource consumption within limits that preserve divine favour. Proposals for new settlements are evaluated according to environmental impact assessments conducted by priest scholars who understand the carrying capacity of different ecological zones, while trade agreements are reviewed to ensure that they do not create the kind of economic pressures that could lead to unsustainable development. The legal codes that govern relations between individuals and communities incorporate explicit recognition of divine authority over all earthly arrangements, establishing principles that subordinate human preferences to cosmic requirements. property ownership is understood as temporary stewardship subject to divine oversight, while commercial contracts include clauses that void agreements if their implementation would violate environmental or population limits. Criminal justice focuses on restoration of cosmic balance rather than punishment or deterrence, seeking remedies that address the spiritual as well as material consequences of antisocial behaviour. Dispute between neighbouring farmers over water rights provides an example of how this new legal system operates in practice. Case is brought before a council that includes both secular judges and religious authorities, with the decision-making process beginning with divination ceremonies that seek divine guidance rather than simply applying predetermined legal precedents. The resolution emphasises the need for both parties to respect the ecological limits that govern water use in their district, while establishing sharing arrangements that preserve the natural systems on which all agricultural activity ultimately depends. The educational systems that prepare young people for adult responsibilities in this new kind of civilization place unprecedented emphasis on environmental knowledge and religious obligation. Children learn not only the practical skills needed for their anticipated occupations, but also the theological principles that govern human relations with the natural world and the divine powers that sustain it. The curriculum includes detailed study of the flood narratives and their implications for contemporary behaviour, ensuring that future generations will understand both the benefits and the dangers of human success under divine protection. School attached to the Temple of Enlil in Kish demonstrates how this integrated approach to education functions in daily practice. Students begin each day with prayers that acknowledge their dependence on divine favour for all learning and future success. While their lessons combine technical instruction with religious education that explains the cosmic significance of human activities. A young student learning to read cuneiform practices with texts that tell the story of the Igigi rebellion and its resolution through human creation, understanding his literacy as both practical skill and sacred responsibility for preserving divine wisdom. Technological development that occurs within these post-flood communities follows patterns that carefully balance human innovation with divine limits on material accumulation. Craftsmen develop new techniques that improve the efficiency and quality of their work, but always within frameworks that prevent the kind of rapid technological change that could disrupt social stability or exceed environmental carrying capacity. Metalsmith named Naram Sin creates bronze tools that serve agricultural and craft needs more effectively than previous implements. But his innovations are evaluated by religious authorities before being adopted to ensure that they support rather than threaten the sustainable development patterns that preserve divine favour. The seasonal festivals that mark important transitions in the agricultural year have evolved to emphasise the theological lessons of the flood experience while maintaining the community celebrations that strengthen social bonds. Spring festival that marks the beginning of planting season includes elaborate ceremonies that reenact the flood narrative, reminding participants of the consequences that follow when human activity exceeds divine limits, while celebrating the mercy that enables survival and renewal. Autumn Harvest Festival combines gratitude for agricultural abundance with commitments to share that abundance equitably and consume it sustainably. During the celebration of the Autumn Festival in Kish, families gather in the temple courtyard to offer the first fruits of their harvests, while reciting prayers that connect their prosperity to the cosmic bargain that ensures continued divine protection. Ceremony includes dramatic presentations of the ancient myths that explain human creation and divine authority, while community feasts demonstrate the abundance that faithful service has earned without the competitive displays of wealth that characterized pre-flood religious celebrations. Preservation and transmission of cultural memory from the pre-flood period presents ongoing and challenges for communities that want to learn from previous achievements without repeating previous mistakes. Scribes who maintain temple libraries carefully copy texts that contain useful technical and legal knowledge while adding commentary that explains the religious context needed for appropriate application. Creation of myths that tell of the Igigi rebellion and the cosmic crisis that led to human creation are preserved as essential theological knowledge. But their copying includes extensive annotation that explains their contemporary relevance for post-flood civilization. A senior scribe named Shamash Hazir spends his days working through collections of pre-flood tablets that survived the catastrophe in sealed containers, evaluating their contents for inclusion in the new canonical collections that will guide future generations. His task requires not only technical skill in reading damaged cuneiform, but also theological sophistication in distinguishing between knowledge that remains valid and information that reflects the unsustainable practices that led to divine intervention. Texts he preserves will shape religious and legal development for centuries to come, while the ones he excludes represent a conscious decision to abandon approaches that proved incompatible with long-term survival. The architectural principles that govern construction in these post-flood settlements reflect both practical needs for flood protection and religious requirements for modest scale that avoids the prideful display that characterized pre-flood urban development. Designed to serve their intended functions efficiently without excess that could suggest improper priorities or unsustainable resource consumption. The temple complex that anchors each community provides adequate space for religious ceremonies without the monumental scale that once demonstrated urban prosperity. While residential buildings offer comfortable family accommodation without the luxury features that marked successful households in the previous age. The construction of a new granary in Kish illustrates how these architectural principles function in practice. The building is sized to store the grain supplies needed for community food security, without excess capacity that could encourage unsustainable accumulation or inequitable distribution. The design emphasizes durability and functionality rather than decorative elaboration, while the materials come from local sources, managed according to sustainable harvesting practices. The construction process includes religious ceremonies at each major stage, seeking divine blessing for the work, while acknowledging that the building serves cosmic purposes rather than merely human convenience. The artistic traditions that develop within post-flood civilization emphasize themes that reinforce religious and environmental values while providing aesthetic pleasure and cultural identity for growing communities. Painters and sculptors create works that celebrate natural beauty and divine authority without the competitive displays of technical virtuosity that characterized pre-flood art, while musicians and poets develop compositions that tell the stories essential for cultural memory, while avoiding the elaborate performances that once marked wealthy urban entertainment. Festival performance in the main square of Kish demonstrates how these artistic principles shape contemporary cultural expression. The drama presented tells the story of the flood and its aftermath, using simple costumes and staging that focus attention on the narrative content rather than spectacular effects. The music that accompanies the performance comes from instruments made by local craftsmen or according to traditional designs, while the songs tell familiar stories that connect current prosperity to divine favor, while reminding audiences of the responsibilities that accompany such blessings. The diplomatic relations that develop between different post-flood settlements are governed by religious protocols that ensure cooperation serves cosmic purposes rather than competitive advantage. Alliances are understood as expressions of divine will rather than secular political calculations, while conflicts are resolved through religious mediation that seeks solutions compatible with environmental and population limits. Treaties that formalize these relationships include explicit acknowledgement of divine authority over all earthly arrangements, creating international law that subordinates human politics to cosmic requirements. Diplomatic mission from the settlement at to the confederations centered at Kish demonstrates how these principles operate in practice. The ambassadors begin their negotiations with joint religious ceremonies that invoke divine guidance for their deliberations. While the agreements they reach include provisions for mutual support that serve community welfare without creating the kind of competitive alliances that could lead to unsustainable military or economic expansion. The treaty that results from their discussions establishes trade relationships and mutual defense arrangements within frameworks that preserve the environmental and social stability that both communities require for long-term survival. The medical practices that develop within these communities integrate physical healing with spiritual restoration, understanding disease and injury as disruptions of cosmic harmony that require religious as well as practical intervention. Healers combine empirical knowledge of medicinal plants and surgical techniques with ritual procedures that address the spiritual causes of physical problems, while public health measures emphasize through lifestyle choices that maintain proper relationships with divine authority and natural systems. Healing ceremony, conducted in the temple of Ningishzida, demonstrates how this integrated approach to medicine functions in daily practice. Patient, a craftsman suffering from persistent illness, receives both herbal treatments that address his physical symptoms and ritual cleansing that corrects spiritual imbalances that may have contributed to his condition. The healer who conducts the ceremony understands illness as a complex phenomenon that involves individual behavior, community relationships, and cosmic harmony, requiring remedies that address all these dimensions simultaneously. The economic systems that govern production and distribution within post-flood civilizations are designed to serve community needs while preventing the accumulation of wealth that could lead to social inequality and environmental degradation. Markets operate according to principles of fair exchange that ensure all participants receive adequate compensation for their contributions, while surplus production is managed through religious institutions that redistribute excess goods to communities or families that face temporary shortages. Market Day in Kish illustrates how these economic principles shape daily commercial activity. Vendors display their goods according to traditional arrangements that ensure equitable access for all potential customers, while prices are set according to established formulas that provide fair compensation without excessive profit. Transactions that occur during the market session are overseen by temple authorities who ensure compliance with religious and environmental standards, while any surplus goods that remain unsold at the end of the day are donated to community welfare programs that serve families in temporary need. The agricultural techniques that sustain these communities have been refined to maximize long-term soil fertility and water conservation, while providing adequate food supplies for stable populations. Farming practices include sophisticated crop rotation systems that preserve and enhance soil nutrients, water management techniques that minimize waste while providing adequate irrigation, and livestock management strategies that integrate animal husbandry with plant agriculture in sustainable cycles that benefit both human communities and natural ecosystems. Farming cooperative that manages agricultural production for several communities around Kish demonstrates how these techniques function in practice. The cooperative's fields are divided into sections that are rotated between different crops according to patterns that maintain soil health, while providing diverse food supplies, while the livestock that graze on fallow fields contribute fertilizer that enriches the soil for future planting. Farmers who work these fields understand their activities as participating in cosmic cycles that connect earthly productivity to divine blessing, requiring religious as well as technical attention to ensure continued success. As the generations pass and the immediate memory of the flood fades into cultural tradition maintained through religious observance and scribal preservation, the new patterns of civilization that emerged from the catastrophe gradually solidify into the foundation for all future Mesopotamian development. Theological understanding that subordinates human ambitions to divine limits, the environmental awareness that prevents unsustainable resource consumption, and the social organization that maintains community welfare within cosmic requirements. All these innovations born from crisis become the inherited wisdom that guides subsequent cultural evolution. The sunset light fades over the settled landscape where scattered communities maintain their careful balance between human achievement and divine tolerance. Their modest fires marking settlements that have learned to flourish within limits that preserve cosmic stability. Tomorrow will bring new challenges as they continue the patient work of building civilization that serves divine purposes while respecting the boundaries that were so dramatically enforced through the Great Flood. New opportunity to demonstrate that human society can achieve prosperity and meaning without threatening the cosmic order that sustains all life. Cosmic experiment that began with the rebellion of the Igigi and led to human creation as divine servants has evolved through crisis into a more mature understanding of the relationship between heaven and earth, an arrangement that acknowledges both human capabilities and human limitations, essential cooperation that benefits all parties to the ancient covenant. The stories preserved in clay tablets speak of divine negotiations and mortal adaptations that continue to shape the ongoing human journey through time, offering wisdom for contemporary challenges while honouring the ancient agreements that first made civilized life possible. The wisdom that emerged from the great cosmic crisis would outlive the civilizations that first preserved it, travelling through time like seeds carried on the wind to take root in cultures that would never know the names of the scribes who first pressed these stories into clay. Traditions that began with the rebellion of the Igigi and the creation of humanity as divine servants continued to evolve long after the immediate trauma of the flood, had passed into cultural memory. Each generation of priest scribes who copied the ancient tablets added their own understanding to the accumulated wisdom, while political changes that brought new dynasties and foreign rulers to power created opportunities for these foundational myths to spread beyond their original geographical boundaries and influence cultures that developed very different approaches to divine human relations. The rise and fall of successive empires across the ancient Near East carried Mesopotamian religious concepts into contact with Egyptian, Anatolian, and Levantine traditions that had emerged from different theological foundations, but faced similar questions about cosmic order, divine authority, and human purpose. Stories of divine labor, celestial rebellion, and cosmic negotiation resonated with themes that appeared in many different mythological systems, creating opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched all the traditions involved, while preserving the essential insights that had emerged from the original crisis in heaven. Picture the great library of Nineveh during the reign of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century, before our era, when Assyrian imperial power extended across most of the known world, and scholars from many different cultures gathered to study and preserve the accumulated wisdom of human civilization. Palace complex that houses this collection contains tens of thousands of tablets written in dozens of languages, presenting mythological, legal, scientific, and literary traditions that span more than 2 millennia of cultural development. In one corner of this vast archive, an elderly Babylonian scholar named Nabu-Zukuk-Kinu works with a team of younger scribes to create a comprehensive edition of the creation myths that tell of the Igigi crisis and its resolution through human service. The tablets they are copying represent multiple traditions and time periods, requiring careful scholarly work to reconcile different versions while preserving the essential narrative that has shaped Mesopotamian understanding of divine human relations since the beginning of written history. The version that emerges from their efforts represents a synthesis of regional traditions that had developed over more than 1,000 years, combining elements from Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian sources into a unified account that could serve the religious and political needs of the diverse population that lived under Assyrian rule. They preserve speaks of cosmic principles that transcend particular cultural boundaries while maintaining the specific theological insights that had emerged from Mesopotamian experience with divine authority and environmental limits. Bruce. This scholarly work takes place against the background of an empire that faces its own challenges in balancing human ambitions with sustainable governance. The Assyrian kingdom has expanded to include territories that stretch from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, creating administrative complexities that strain the traditional mechanisms of imperial control. The environmental pressures that accompany such extensive urban development and resource extraction echo the problems that led to the original cosmic crisis, suggesting that the ancient myths may contain practical wisdom for contemporary political challenges. The scholars who work on these texts understand that they are preserving more than historical curiosities, creation myths that speak of divine labor disputes and cosmic negotiations, provide templates for addressing the tensions between central authority and local autonomy that characterize all large political systems, while the flood narratives offer guidance for managing the environmental consequences of human success. The theological principles embedded in these ancient stories remain relevant for rulers who must balance competing demands. while maintaining the divine favour that ensures political legitimacy. As the Assyrian Empire gradually gives way to Babylonian and then Persian control over the region, the cuneiform tablets that preserve these creation myths continue to be copied and studied by successive generations of scholars and priests. Persian rulers, following policies that encourage cultural diversity within imperial unity, allow local traditions to flourish while incorporating useful elements into their own administrative and religious systems. The stories of the Igigi rebellion find new audiences among Persian magi, who see parallels to their own dualistic understanding of cosmic conflict between forces of light and darkness. Persian administrator named Artaxerxes serves as provincial governor in Babylon during the reign of Darius the Great, responsible for ensuring that local religious traditions remain compatible with imperial policy while preserving the cultural autonomy that makes Persian rule acceptable to conquered populations. His approach to governing involves careful study of Mesopotamian myths and legal traditions, seeking to understand the theological principles that have sustained these communities through centuries of political change. The insights he gains from studying the creation epics prove valuable for addressing practical governance challenges that arise in his province. The ancient stories of divine negotiation and cosmic compromise provide models for resolving conflicts between competing interest groups, while the flood narratives offer guidance for managing large-scale environmental projects that could affect the welfare of entire regions. Theological framework that subordinates earthly authority to cosmic principles helps maintain political legitimacy while ensuring that imperial policies remain compatible with local religious sensibilities. The gradual spread of these Mesopotamian creation myths beyond their original cultural boundaries occurs through multiple channels that reflect the interconnected nature of ancient civilizations. Merchants who travel the trade routes that connect different regions carry religious as well as commercial ideas, while diplomatic missions that negotiate treaties and alliances often involve cultural exchanges that introduce new theological concepts to foreign courts. Military camps that bring different peoples into contact create opportunities for mythological traditions to influence each other in ways that enrich all the cultures involved. Hebrew communities that develop distinctive monotheistic traditions during the period of Babylonian exile encounter Mesopotamian creation myths through direct contact with the scholars and priests who maintain these ancient traditions. Stories they hear of cosmic rebellion, divine judgment, and human creation as divine service resonate with their own theological concerns, while challenging some of their fundamental assumptions about the relationship between heaven and earth. A Hebrew scribe named Ezra works with Babylonian colleagues during the exile period, studying cuneiform texts that contain versions of the Igigi rebellion and the flood narrative that resolved the cosmic crisis. Theological insights he gains from this cross-cultural studies influence his own understanding of divine justice and human responsibility. While the narrative techniques he observes in Mesopotamian literature shape his approach to preserving Hebrew religious traditions for future generations, the creation accounts that eventually emerge in Hebrew scripture reflect this cultural interaction while maintaining distinctive theological perspectives that emphasize monotheistic principles and covenant relationships between the divine and human realms. Stories of cosmic rebellion become transformed into narratives of angelic disobedience, while the flood accounts preserve the essential themes of divine judgment and merciful preservation, while adapting them to Hebrew understanding of universal divine sovereignty. These adapted versions of the ancient Mesopotamian themes travel through Jewish communities that spread across the Mediterranean world during the Hellenistic period, encountering Greek philosophical traditions that approach similar questions about cosmic order and human purpose from very different intellectual foundations. The synthesis that emerges from this cultural interaction influences early Christian theology, while preserving essential insights from the original myths about divine labour, cosmic justice, and the complex negotiations that govern relations between heaven and earth. Political changes that bring Roman control to the eastern Mediterranean create new opportunities for these theological traditions to influence imperial policy and popular culture. Roman administrators who encounter local religious traditions often find practical wisdom in ancient myths that address universal challenges of governance, environmental management, and social organization. The stories that began with the rebellion of the Igigi continue to offer relevant guidance for contemporary leaders who must balance competing demands while maintaining the legitimacy that ensures stable government. As the Roman Empire gradually adopts Christian religious traditions that incorporate elements from both Hebrew and Mesopotamian sources. The ancient creation myths that speak of cosmic labor and divine rebellion find new expression in theological discussions about the nature of divine authority and human service. The original stories of the Igigi crisis become transformed into Christian narratives of angelic rebellion and divine mercy, while the flood traditions provide templates for understanding divine judgment and the possibility of redemption through faithful service. The preservation of these theological traditions through the tumultuous centuries that mark the transition from ancient to medieval civilization requires the dedicated efforts of monastic communities and institutions that maintain libraries and copying centers throughout the changing political landscape. The creation myths that originated in Mesopotamian temple schools continue their evolution through Islamic, Jewish, and Christian scholarly traditions that find different applications for their insights while preserving their essential wisdom about the complex relationships between divine authority, human responsibility, and cosmic order. Medieval Islamic scholar named al-Tabari works in Baghdad, the city that stands near the site of ancient Babylon, studying Arabic translations of creation myths that trace their origins to the earliest Mesopotamian traditions. Scholarly work involves not preserving these ancient narratives, but also interpreting their significance for contemporary religious and political challenges. Stories of divine rebellion and cosmic negotiation provide frameworks for understanding the theological questions that arise in Islamic discussions of divine sovereignty and human stewardship. The transmission of these traditions through medieval scholarly networks ensures their preservation through the period when the original cuneiform tablets lie buried and forgotten under the accumulated debris of centuries. The essential insights that emerged from the cosmic crisis in ancient Mesopotamia continue to influence religious and philosophical development in cultures that have lost all direct connection to their original sources, demonstrating the universal relevance of questions about authority, service, and justice that transcend particular historical circumstances. The rediscovery of cuneiform literature during the 19th century creates opportunities for modern scholars to compare these medieval transmission traditions with their original sources revealing both the theme's remarkable preservation of essential themes adds to each that allowed ancient wisdom to remain relevant for successive generations. The archaeological excavations that uncover the buried libraries of ancient cities provide direct access to the tablets that contain the original versions of creation myths, while the decipherment of cuneiform script makes possible scholarly study of these texts in their original languages and cultural contexts. British Museum receives its first major collection of cuneiform tablets during the 1850s, when diplomatic and archaeological expeditions to Mesopotamia bring back thousands of clay documents that have survived in the dry soil of the region for more than 2 millennia. The scholars who undertake the challenging work of decipherment discover among these texts multiple versions of creation epics that tell stories remarkably similar to familiar biblical narratives, while providing additional details and alternative perspectives that illuminate the cultural background of ancient Near Eastern religious traditions. A Victorian scholar named George Smith achieves fame by deciphering portions of the Atrahasis epic that contain detailed accounts of the flood narrative, demonstrating clear parallels to the biblical story of Noah, while revealing the broader mythological context that connects human creation to cosmic labor disputes and divine negotiations. His discoveries generate intense public interest while providing academic foundation for comparative religious studies that examine how similar themes develop in different cultural contexts. The continuing work of archaeological excavation and textual scholarship throughout the 20th and 21st centuries gradually reveals the full complexity of Mesopotamian creation traditions, showing how stories of the Igigi rebellion and cosmic crisis evolved over thousands of years, while preserving essential insights about the relationship between divine authority and human responsibility. Modern translations make these ancient texts accessible to contemporary readers who find in them universal themes that remain relevant for understanding questions about work and justice, authority and service, individual rights, and collective responsibilities. The digital preservation projects that now make cuneiform texts available through online databases ensure that the wisdom preserved in clay tablets will remain accessible to future generations of scholars and interested readers. The stories that began as attempts to understand cosmic order and divine intentions continues for contemporary insights for discussions, justice about environmental limits, social justice, and the proper relationship between human ambitions and sustainable development. Creation myths that speak of divine labor, celestial rebellion, and cosmic negotiation provide frameworks for understanding contemporary challenges that echo the ancient problems they were designed to address. The environmental crises that threaten modern civilization reflect the same tensions between human success and ecological limits that led to the Great Flood, while debates about economic inequality, and fair distribution of resources echo the concerns about divine justice that motivated the original Igigi rebellion. The university libraries and research institutions that house modern collections of Mesopotamian literature serve functions similar to the ancient temple libraries, where these texts were first preserved, maintaining cultural memory while making accumulated wisdom available for contemporary application. The scholars who study these texts understand themselves as continuing the work of preservation and interpretation that began with the first scribes who pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets to record stories that seemed essential for understanding human purpose and cosmic order. Modern Assyriologist, working in a university research center, continues the millennia-long tradition of copying and interpreting these creation myths, using digital tools to create editions and translations that make ancient wisdom accessible to contemporary audiences. Her work involves not only technical expertise in reading cuneiform script, but also cultural sensitivity in interpreting theological concepts that emerged from very different social and political contexts, while addressing universal human concerns. The insights that emerge from contemporary study of these ancient texts demonstrate their continuing relevance for understanding the complex relationships between individual freedom and collective responsibility, between human creativity and environmental sustainability, between local autonomy and global cooperation. The stories that began with the rebellion of the Igigi and led to human creation as divine servants continue to offer wisdom for navigating challenges that test the viability of civilization itself. The international conferences where scholars present research on Mesopotamian literature create opportunities for cross-cultural dialogue that echoes the ancient exchanges between different regional traditions. The discussions that take place in these academic settings demonstrate how themes that originated in specific historical contexts can illuminate universal questions that face all human societies, and regardless of their particular cultural backgrounds or technological capabilities. Translation projects that make these texts available in multiple modern languages ensure that the wisdom they contain can influence contemporary thought in ways that transcend the academic specialists who conduct technical research. Creation myths that tell of cosmic labor and divine rebellion find new audiences among readers who discover for understanding modern challenges related to work and meaning, authority and justice, individual rights and collective welfare. The story we have followed through this long night reaches across millennia to connect ancient wisdom with contemporary concerns, demonstrating how questions that emerged from specific historical crises continue to resonate with universal human experiences. Rebellion of the Igigi that led to cosmic negotiations and human creation as divine servants speaks to eternal tensions between freedom and responsibility, between individual desires and collective needs that face every generation in every culture. The same stars that shone above the first Mesopotamian cities, where scribes pressed these stories into clay tablets, continue their ancient courses across night skies that look down on modern communities still struggling with questions of justice and sustainability, authority and service, individual fulfillment and collective survival. The soil that preserves the tablets containing creation myths continues to nourish the crops that sustain human life, while the rivers that witness the rise and fall of ancient civilizations still flow toward seas that connect all lands and peoples in shared dependence on natural systems that transcend political boundaries. Let the soft hum of your fan carry you toward rest, as gentle as the evening breeze that once whispered through reed houses along rivers where the first cities took root. Let your breathing slow to match the ancient rhythms that govern seasonal cycles and cosmic order, when gods and mortals negotiated the terms that still shape our understanding of purpose and responsibility. The room grows quiet around you as the day's concerns fade into the peaceful darkness that embraces all who seek wisdom in the stories that connect past and future in endless patterns of meaning. Rest. Easy knowing that the ancient agreements between heaven and earth continue their quiet work while you sleep. that the same cosmic forces that resolved the rebellion of the Igigi still maintain the delicate balance that makes life and dreams possible, that tomorrow will bring its own opportunities to participate in the ongoing conversation between divine authority and human creativity that began when the universe was young and will continue as long as consciousness seeks meaning in the vast patterns that connect all existence.